I think it's time to begin our seventh session, and I'm happy to do so and present Edmund Hayes, who is a historian. Everyone ready? We're still in lunch break. Ed Hayes is a historian of the social, cultural, and religious history of the medieval Middle East, with a particular focus on Shi'i Islam. He's the author of Agents of the Imam, Forging 12-Verse Shi'ism, 850 to 950, published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. And he's part of the Radboud University project, led by Maaike van Berkel, Source of Water, Water Management in the Pre-Modern Middle East. In January 2024, Ed will start as assistant professor at Leiden University. Congratulations. And at the same time, begin an ERC starting grant project, Embodied Imamate, Mapping the Development of the Early Shi'i Community, 700 to 900 CE. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thanks, first of all, to Yaniv and to all of the organizers at the Institute. I'm very happy to be here and I've learned a lot. I'm very conscious as well that I'm the first paper after lunch. So I've specifically chosen my words and I will modulate my tones to aid your digestion, bringing blood to where you need it. And I hope there's some blood left for your brains as well. So apologies for the change in title. I did start off with, as promised in the program, looking at communal boundaries in Shia Hadith and Shia Sunni Hadith. And I followed one of these into another rabbit hole, which led me towards the bathhouse. And I'm also drawing on an article that that's currently under review with my colleague Maaike van Berkel, Governing Water and Public Health in the Islamic City. Yeah, it's a very nice picture. She's a nice person. So this is the hadith that I took as my sort of first inspiration. Do not wash or do ablutions from the runoff water of the bathhouse. The one who washes in it washes from adultery. Okay. It has been used to wash the offspring of adultery and to wash our opponents, the opponents of the family of the Prophet, and it contains their evil. So this is a statement from the Shia Imam, and he says that the water that comes from the public bathhouse has been used to wash, among other people, adulterers, but also the people who oppose the Imams, and also Ali ibn Abi Talib, the sort of forefather of the Imam. So it's a kind of the primordial split in, or one of the primordial splits in early Islamic history is responsible for present impurity that has apparently consequences for ritual purity and how you manage your interaction with urban space. And so this was interesting to me. So this is mid-8th century sort of text, purports to be. I'm going to move a few centuries onward, but this initial thought about how does thinking about purity influence the way you navigate space and navigate communal relations in your life in cities is what sort of inspired me. Before I continue, though, I'm going to bring up Mary Douglas, which I'm surprised at a conference of purity. We haven't had a whole bunch of summaries of who Mary Douglas is and what she said. So at the danger of boring you with stuff you all know, I would like to just, draw on her for a definition of purity. So she suggests that, or sort of to précis her, she suggests that purity is a kind of ordering principle of life which determines what things should be mixed and associated and what should not be mix, what should be kept separate. She famously also stresses the place of anomalous elements in sources of pollution, like our friend the rock badger up here. I hope nobody has been eating any rock badgers lately. I think she takes as her core assumption of what purity is the idea of something that's concrete and material. But she also explores the links with this material realm to moral, social, political, and cosmological levels of influence. And this is one of the things that I've been thinking about, also listening to the papers the last couple of days, this relationship between morality and sort of concretized thinking about purity. Purity discourses and practices for Douglas are called in to reinforce systems of morality at weak points where they are most likely to be breached or challenged. So there is a purity connotation in what we might call, by other terms, evil or sin. Now, turning to Islam, there are various terms that could be used for an investigation of systems of purity. Most obviously, the distinction between halal and haram. But there's also a lot of other words there. Some of them are more closely related to halal and haram and more distantly. So words like najasa, tahara, wudu, by which you remove impurity, and also terms for heresy and unbelief also often interact with this kind of semantic web of terms that are sort of purity derived or derived from purity, a purity discourse. So I will return to this later, but now I'm going to talk about bathhouses. So thinking, I'm using bathhouses, I guess, to try and start in a zone where you would expect to see ideas of purity and impurity and purification worked out on this concrete level, by thinking about the concrete act of washing as a way to remove impurity. Bathhouses, as I think were mentioned in the previous paper, are, however, locations. They are themselves sort of ambivalent, ambiguous locations. They are locations in which purification is performed, but they are also produce impurities, right? They result in a lot of gunk. They have a religious function by, the higher Middle Ages, but they're also a secular place for entertainment and relaxation. They are public places, yet they are very intimate spaces where intimate processes to go on. And again, the mention of the jinn or the demons also emphasize this sort of ambivalence of their function. In the earliest days of Islam, there was a distrust of bathhouses as associated with nakedness, but also with the hell-like fire of the furnaces that were used to heat the water. However, despite this, in later medieval Islam, bathhouses become a Muslim institution, I would say, or certainly related to Islam, often placed near mosques, because they're a convenient place to do the ablution, the whole body ablution that's required for major ritual impurities. In my thinking about this, I'm going to be looking at one text in particular, a 14th century manual on the Hisba, so on the instructions for the market inspector, who's a public official paid by the government who's in charge of regulating, yes, the marketplace, economic life, but also public order and morality in general. The book I'm looking at in particular is by a man known as Ibn al-Ukhuwa, who is an Egyptian author. And now, the relationships between these texts is somewhat complex. So this one, we do see there are, he does derive parts of the text, pretty much verbatim from earlier texts, including a manual, probably a Syrian manual by a Shazali, and then and something by an Iraqi scholar, Al-Mawardi, in the previous couple of centuries. However, it does have specifically Egyptian features. It mentions the Nile, it mentions the Nilometer. So it's certainly been at least adapted to local circumstances, even if we can't necessarily take it to be a record of what's going on at the local level. And we see purity issues throughout this book, including some of them are status of Jews and Christians, the protected people, Ahl al-Dhimma, bathhouses, which we'll look at in a second. Witnesses at court. Witnesses should be both upstanding morally, but also there is a discussion of purity. Drinking water, food in general, especially meats that are slaughtered, things that have a particular ritual purity implication. Wine and fraud, which is also discussed in specifically halal, haram terms. We can think of this as moral impurity, but it is that the language is related to ritual impurity, and leather and its products. And of course, purity here also interacts with other ideas like hygiene and public nuisance, right? Avoiding public nuisance. So it's sometimes very difficult to see actually when he's talking in practice, what kind of regulation, what it's for, what it's doing there. Chapter 42 of this book is devoted to the bathhouses and how they should be policed by this market inspector, the Muhtasib, as he's called. The chapter on bathhouses is made up of two sections. He starts off with conceptual framings and then continues to practical instructions. The conceptual section itself can be split into two. The first he derives from a sort of Galenic medical understanding of health, followed by a section informed by Islamic piety. In the practical instructions section, we see a mingling of both of these, the Hellenistic medicine and the Islamic legal and pietistic concerns. And in the conceptual section, the starting section, both the medical norms and the Islamic legal norms are introduced on the authority of figures from the past. Ibn al-Ukhuwa introduces his comments on medical issues by alluding to the sages and philosophers of the past, the hukama. He says, a certain one among the sages has said that the best bathhouse is, and then he gives a list of qualities of the best bathhouse. And then he gives a list of the pros and cons of bathhouses, and these are very clearly Galenic. He says, quote, hammams have their value and their danger. Their value is that they clear away the organs of smell, evacuate superfluities, dissolve vapors, clean away dirt, al-wasakh, and sweat. The dangers outlined in this section are likewise physical. The danger is that they relax the body, enfeeble the natural heat when too long a stay is made. And I'm sure all of the Europeanists in the room can also think of very similar discussions in their material. Following this overview of the major physiological benefits and dangers of baths from the body, Ibn al-Ukhuwa outlines in a piecemeal fashion the moral and religious dangers related to them. So this is the Islamic sort of conceptual section. He alludes to the contested status of baths in hadith reports and opinions of great Muslim jurists and authorities from the past. The early debates that he alludes to focus both on purity and on modesty. He initially focuses more on modesty, in fact, than purity. And this focus is related to the public nature of the institution. He mentions that women in particular are more easily prey to forms of lawlessness and inappropriate behavior, such as indecent dressing while bathing, than men, due to their sensuality. The Muhtasib has to ensure proper behavior at these public spaces, and the manuals contain a few practical regulations to enforce this. For all their dangers, Ibn al-Ukhuwa argues that a woman should visit the public baths only, quote, after childbirth or being ill. So a shout out to all the postpartum purification fans in the house. If a woman does go to the bath, then she should, quote, wear a cloak reaching to the ground. And it's worth saying, though, that elsewhere in the book, Ibn al-Ukhuwa recognizes there are hammams entirely for women in the city, and which young men should be kept away from. So this suggests that women are, in fact, going to the hammams in relatively large numbers, and that abstention from the practice is an ideal rather than something that is actually being regulated. Following the conceptual and normative sections on Galenic medical and Islamic legal and pietistic attitudes to the public baths, Ibn al-Ukhuwa proceeds to a more general and practical, almost hands-on instructions which weave together the logics of various discourses. In his instructions on how to maintain the cleanliness of the facilities, we see language that emerges from both of these medical and Islamic discourses. We're told that, quote, the hammam is used for doing ritual ablutions. Quote, the bath owner must give orders that the hammam shall be opened early because people need it to perform their ablutions before prayers. As a result, its maintenance is aimed at preventing breaking states of ritual purity of the hammam's users. If people are doing it because of prayer, then there has to be regulations in place that make sure that it is suitable for achieving that kind of purity. So, for example, quote, the muhtasib must order the bath workers to wash the hammam and sweep it, and that cleaning it should be done with ritually pure, tahir, water, not runoff water from washing, ma al-ghusala. So even the washing the floor should be done with pure water. We are told elsewhere that runoff water cannot be reused, which is in line with the explicit prohibition in Islamic legal texts from reusing water used for ablutions. Thus, the logic of maintenance of the hammam facilities is explicitly and implicitly tied not only to our concern for bodily health and general cleanliness, but for purity and necessity to Muslim ritual. The cleaning of the water tank is a clear priority. Quote, the supply tank should be cleansed each day of the dirt, awsakh, that gathers in it, and likewise the basins and the water kettles should be cleansed of the dirt that gathers from the water channels, and the sediment that settles at the bottom will be removed each month, because if it is left for longer than that, the water will be changed in taste and smell. The word for dirt used in this passage, awsakh, is very general, doesn't specifically refer to ritual impurity. However, while the interests in the changing state, the change of state of water, so the taste and smell, this is something we see in Galenic medical texts. But here the pairing of taste and smell seems to draw more directly upon Islamic legal phraseology, which uses these two tests as a sign of ritual purity. In addition to the water supply itself, other materials used in the infrastructure of the baths must be ritually pure. So, quote, pipes must not be stopped with hair combings, but with ritually pure rags or palm fibers. And I love the fact that the bath owner is potentially going around picking out the hairballs that Gallet, you know, a good thrifty medieval person uses all the pieces he can find. Although economical, the use of the built-up human hair combings might bring various issues of ritual impurity with it. However, further on, cleaning regimes are more directly tied to apparently medical categories. So, quote, twice a day, male frankincense, mastic, or laudanum should be used for fumigation. Such ingredients are common parts of a materia medica toolkit and would play no role in producing ritual purity. At another level, cleaning as a preventative health measure is a matter of practical common sense, deriving from neither medical nor Islamic legal discourses. Quote, the stone floor must be scrubbed with some rough material to prevent adhesion of lote leaves and marshmallow leaves on which it is possible to slip. Lote leaves were used instead of soap. According to Ibn al-Ukhuwa, lack of hygiene or impurity could also be caused by specific visitors. So, quote, no person suffering from elephantitis or leprosy should be admitted. And, quote, shoemakers and felt makers must not be allowed to wash their leather and felt in the hammam. Very good advice, I think. These clearly have ritual purity implications, but also could be interpreted in the context of public nuisance, which is also a key category for Ibn al-Ukhuwa throughout the book. Within the chapter on bathhouse maintenance, then, we see both impractical ideals and concrete instructions meant to be carried out. The chapter's conceptual section at the beginning separates between Galenic and Islamic legal principles legitimated by authorities from the past, and medical authorities anonymized, and the Islamic authorities clearly named. Among the practical instructions, we see both religious ritual purity being mixed without being clearly signposted, other than at the lexical level through the deployment of vocabulary specific to either domain. So me as a philologist, I'm going through and saying, that looks Galenic, that looks sort of Islamic legal category, but it's mixed in the instructions. The chapter does indeed display anxiety about social mixing, what Douglas would think of as guarding the gateways between social class and religious community, gender, and the gateways of access to forbidden areas of the body. Thus, the barbers at the bath, quote, shall not shave the cheek of a catamite, nor the chin of a hermaphrodite, so not breaking down boundaries of gender. And, quote, the muhtasib should inspect the hammams frequently. If he sees anyone leaving his nakedness uncovered, he must punish him. And, quote, another reprehensible practice is that of the bath attendants who uncover the thigh and what is below the navel. Another is that of inserting the hand under the loin. It is against the law to touch the genitals of others. He also takes the opportunity of fulminating against the inappropriate clothes of women these days. These aspects tend to be less specifically about physical ritual purity and rather mixed issues of modesty and general morality. While ritual purity emerges as relatively simple to control, social mixing appears more problematic and complex to regulate. And in order to understand this, the complexity of regulation, I want to turn to a different chapter in which principles of mixing and not mixing are stated more clearly. At the beginning of the book, after general principles are set out, the first two substantive chapters dealing with specific issues are chapter 3 on wine and forbidden musical instruments, followed by chapter 4, which I'm going to focus on now, on the peoples protected by treaty, the Jews and the Christians, though Ibn al-Ukhuwa is particularly concerned about Christians. Before specific rules are discussed, there is a long section in which the precedents of the past are drawn upon, in which it is suggested that, quote, leniency towards the protected peoples in matters which religion has ruled upon is a grave danger, khatar azim. A report is cited in which the Prophet Muhammad was said to have ordered the expulsion of Jews and Christians from the Arabian Peninsula, a historical model for spatial purification that serves now as an ideal and model to justify communal regulations. There follows several anecdotes from early Islamic history in which the principle of exclusion, especially of Christians, is affirmed. Thus, in one story, a useful Christian bureaucrat is converted at the hands of the governor of Basra, who then teaches him in particular how to pray and how to do ritual purity, tahara. This is followed by the statement, it is incumbent upon the muhtasib to regulate the protected peoples and to enforce upon them the conditions set for them, which they agreed to in the olden days, Qadim Zaman. The structures of communal separation then are clearly identified as aspects of history which weigh upon the present. To substantiate this, Ibn al-Ukhuwa quotes the famous letter of Umar, in this case Umar ibn al-Khattab, enumerating the communal rules and restrictions imposed upon Christians at the time of the conquests. Some of these elements might be seen as purity-focused, such as the restriction on selling wine, but in general, these regulations appear to be more focused on aspects of political subversion and manifestation in public spaces, and to restrict proselytization. Thus, clothes are to be worn that visually mark them as separate, for example. Bathhouses too are mentioned, and it is suggested that Christians should wear a brass or copper seal on their necks. It is not stated explicitly, but presumably this visual identification is particularly necessary in the baths where all other garments are removed. The principle throughout this letter of Umar is tamyiz, separation or distinction. Again, not a ritual purity term. Thus, Ibn al-Huwa states that Christians should not have houses which are built higher than those of Muslims, and he summarizes the function of these regulations as follows. The purpose of all this is to, this is a quote, purpose of all this is to distinguish between them and Muslims in a fashion which shall prevent any dignity being acquired by them. It is worth noting that modern scholars have been generally skeptical that such rules of visual separation, like the special clothes and the seals around the necks, were indeed consistently applied or applied at all in medieval Muslim cities. In general, then, these historical reports are cited as model examples of visual and spatial separations that would be applied were it possible, while grudgingly implying that it is probably not possible on the whole. Following all of this, Ibn al-Ukhuwa laments that things are not like the old days, with the maudlin statement, quote, "If only Omar could see the Jews and Christians nowadays." He chafes against what he sees as the prosperity and high status of Christians, and he proceeds with a long screed of contemporary violations of the ancient stipulations that were being carried out, including calling themselves by Muslim names, riding horses, even to the extent of having Muslim servants who run alongside by the stirrup of their master, a clear inversion of the rightful moral and political order. He also discusses women's behavior in hammams as another example of the modern state of immorality. As for the women, when they leave their houses and walk in the streets, they are hardly to be recognized. Also in the baths, a Christian woman frequently will sit in the chief place, while the Muslim women will sit below her. They go into the markets also and sit in the shops of the merchants who pay them respect on account of their fine clothes, unaware that they belong to the protected peoples. Clearly then, there is an anxiety about mixing, but the dominant issue with mixing appears not to be related to ritual purity in the sort of strictest material sense. Instead, Ibn al-Ukhuwa's concern appears to be more broadly social and political. He is concerned about the bathhouse, and indeed other areas of the city, as being dangerous domains because Muslims and Christians are mixing, and Christians cannot be systematically separated and subordinated to Muslims in status, as he imagines they were in the good days of the pious ancestors. So, to begin to draw to a conclusion, I'm going to turn back to Mary Douglas. How would she understand all this? Douglas notes that, quote, "Rituals of purity and impurity create unity in experience. By their means, symbolic patterns are worked out and publicly displayed. Within these patterns, disparate elements are related and disparate experience is given meaning." However, Douglas is looking at what she calls primitive cultures, what we might call instead technologically or structurally simple. These cultures are characterized by having a relatively homogeneous system of symbols and institutions among its members. Quote, "Each primitive culture is a universe to itself. This simplicity and homogeneity is absolutely not the case with medieval Islamic Cairo of Ibn al-Ukhuwa, a complex society in which numerous cults coexist within Islam, as well as many other religious communities. Many of the rigid boundaries inherited from a pristine image of the past were practically unworkable, and perhaps always had been. Ibn al-Ukhuwa instead filters the received tradition and asserts a level of ideal and a level of the practical. The historical ideals act as a way to discursively lay out principles, but not necessarily to introduce a program of action. By contrast, the program of action comes in a multitude of tiny, feasible acts, such as sweeping the roads of muck and correcting one's dress. The past is mobilized to justify separation, and especially visual separation, as well as spatial separation of, for example, men and women or religious communities in different city quarters where they tend to live, or in the public spaces that they share. We might argue that such visual and spatial separation do serve material purity regulations, So if you cannot distinguish between community members, then you can't impose necessary purity restrictions on them. However, the primary concern that appears to emerge, at least from my reading, is political. It shows who is on top, who should control urban space, and the display of identity in public. None of this is especially new. Within Douglas's framework, the reason for this would be related to the scope of Islamic purity regulations. If purity laws function partially to reinforce political hierarchies, they do so by symbolically mobilizing and canalizing action towards communal goals. But ritual practice can only fulfill this function among those who participate and subscribe to the ritual community in question. For non-Muslims, Muslim ritual purity rules would not engage the self in these hierarchies, but rather would represent coercive impositions from an outside force. So from this Douglasian sense of the moral and political being reinforced by the concrete purity and pollution stipulation, is not going to work if you don't subscribe to the religious dogma that backs up the purity regulations. In the case of medieval Cairo, then, characterized by a legal pluralism within the Muslim communities themselves, as well as the existence of non-Muslim communities, the relative coherency and homogeneity of Douglas's quote-unquote primitive cultures is replaced by a Muslim hegemony that can police boundaries but cannot dictate to the consciences of the subjects. In this case, separation of communities through political symbolism and the mobilization of historical discourses of submission and protection emerge to supersede purity regulations as primary tools of urban regulation. Recourse to the past legitimates present practice, as well as surrounding contemporary slippages and ambiguities with a nostalgia for lost and indeed impractical ideals. However, a final caveat should be added. There is something I find circular about Douglas's definition of purity. In particular, her separation of material and morality is difficult to maintain empirically. In the Islamic terminology of halal and haram, as I alluded to at the beginning, the physical and the moral are intimately connected. And I haven't done this, but perhaps inseparable. From this point of view, we can reasonably talk about a halal political praxis, which would align with Douglas's conception of morality, but which in Islamic terminology would not be clearly distinguishable from the material practice of ablution and avoidance of polluting essences, which we tend to think of as ritual purity proper. And thank you for your
Thank you, Ed. Yes, Debbie.
Okay, two comments and two questions. One of the comments about what you said about the hammam with women. So there's a story from the Seljuk period, the first occupation of Topelbek in Baghdad with his army, and they were there for a year, that the Turkmens went to the women's hammam and climbed on top to look through the skylights and then burst in and were like raping women and molested and stuff. So that was, they definitely were going to the hammam. Oh, it's in all the big chronicles.
Okay.
Ibn al-Jawzi, Sibt ibn al-Jawzi, Ibn al-Athir. I can send you the reference if you want. And the second one about the impracticality or otherwise the enforcement of the sartorial laws. There again, in early Seljuk times, there's an episode, and that I've actually translated that passage in Nimrod's collection. Yes, and from Sibt ibn al-Jawzi, and there's where the caliph just puts out a rescript to enforce on the upper class of the dhimmis, because obviously the lower class ones, it was being enforced, but on the upper class of the dhimmis, yes, that he wants them also, and it's very explicit about the one red shoe and the one black shoe and the sign that says dhimmi around the necks and all this kind of thing. And it was very strictly enforced, and as a result, and he also fired people in the who were working illegally in the bureaucracy. And so his Christian Khatib, Ibn Musalaya, converts to Islam at the caliph's hands, and they have this big party to celebrate it. And he ends up, of course, all of his money ends up going to Islamic causes and onto his family.
Sorry,
So that's,
when was that?
that was in early Seljuk times. That was
Mm.
before 1100. I don't remember the exact year.
Yeah,
But I can, again, I can send it to you. So those are the two comments. Query, when you said hermaphrodite, is that muhannath? What's the word?
I'll check for you. I don't-
Because I'm curious about that. Can
So Levy translated this, right? So I was using, so Levy's, for those non-Arabists who are interested, it's translated, the full text translated, though partially, it's annoying because
His translation is always very loose.
some of it's really good, but he doesn't, it's sort of, he prays these bits. And for the purpose of this, you know, he cuts out all of the past, which I was trying to recover. So I went back for the past bits, I went back and retranslated myself and I checked it, but I can check it.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
but,
you.
yeah.
Could you say a few words about that first passage that you showed up there where it says about the water and the purity of those who deny?
Yeah.
Shiruhum.
Yeah.
It is their evil, it
Yeah,
is their
that's how I
wickedness.
translated. I don't know, Rob, if you want to come in on this one.
That's a
So
fun construction. At the very end, there
that's-
was Shiruhum.
yeah, I think that's how it is their evil. So the water is their evil,
Yeah,
I would
what does
say.
he mean by that?
I think it contains their bad doing, and you do see this in other contexts. So when you pay zakat, famously,
Right.
it can't be the Ahlul Bayt, the pure
Too
lineage of
pure to
prophet
accept it.
can't accept the money that is given in charity because people use it to purify themselves, and then it contains their impurity in it, and that's wasakh as well. Here, it doesn't mention anything it's evil, but that's how I understood it.
Yeah, it's just a very striking phrase.
Yeah, and the reason I didn't pursue this is because I didn't find much more of this. So I have to do a separate work in a separate paper about the Nasib, which is an interesting category.
Is it only water that can carry?
No, so that's money. So that
Oh, right.
the charity, when you pay charity, it purifies you, and then there's this sense of it that contains a residual, dirt, a residual impurity. It has no ritual purity implications.
No, impurity is not contagious in Islam. You don't pass it on.
But then they're not allowed to receive this money, so apparently there's something to it, right?
Right, we're here.
That's,
Yeah, I think that
But
That's
it's
not
also
much-
Shiites are actually a little different on that.
if this, I didn't understand this facet in meaning, in money, but
no,
impurity.
this is water. I'm just saying that when you do something to purify yourself, then the thing that does the purifying takes away your impurity, that there is a ritual impurity
Yes, but
implication.
it cannot contaminate.
No,
someone
that's not
else.
true. That's not true. You do, the water that is used, you use to ablute, it's not necessarily fully impure, like it's not like pig's blood or something, but there are restrictions surrounding it, showing that it's not just like perfectly pure water.
Right, like the question of if a dog urinates in water, can you use it for ablutions? Like, oh, the monkeys say yes, who else says it carries impurity and it can't purify.
Well, and also that
Can't
the
purify,
ablution,
it doesn't mean that it makes you impure, that it.
Well,
has
but
some
it's not,
impurity.
well.
That's
so
because
the-
you're already
In
impure.
my
You're
opinion,
coming
but
from
let's
food.
not,
Yeah.
let's open this up.
Yeah. I mean, there's a debate
Well, no,
on
it's because you're impure already, so it can't give you more impurity than you have.
No, but you also
But
can't,
you
you
can't
can't- you
remove it.
have to use, you have to ablute with
Right.
something that is pure,
Right,
right? You
right.
don't ablute with.
Unless you're a
impure water.
Maliki and a dog peed in the water.
Okay.
It's my favorite case.
Well, there's a Shi'i hadith as well, is if there's a body of water and there's a dead dog in it, or a corpse in it, can you ablute from it? And the Imam says, you go to the other side of the pond.
That's fair. What about that Shiite practice about these not like impurity washing off them in the rain, and so when you're on, they would let them go outside.
I really.
Rain, yeah.
Eric?
Yeah, Mary Douglas, so you started at the beginning with the definition of purity, and I expected you to also talk about her view of, impurity and dirt in, matter out of place, and also could mean transgressing boundaries. And so then I started thinking about, I think it could really apply well to, because when you think about it, the bath could be an ambiguous place, right? Because it's designed to wash you off.
Mhm.
But then those things are, could be impure. So, is it a matter out of place or it's the place where it should be, right? Like, so, but there's
Yeah.
that transgression. So I thought that there was a lot there that could, that you could also use if you want. I just wondered if you had thoughts on it.
Yeah, I didn't see a lot of it, and I started looking for that kind of thing, and then I ended up with finding more of a political
Yeah.
control of space kind of thing. So, but you do see it, like the fact that you can't use the combings of hair
Right.
to stop up the taps is clearly,
Yeah.
yeah, you have to regulate the main basin where which you splash water on. And so if that gets dirty, then it's useless to purify it. So,
You don't think with there seems to be a little bit of an element of the gentleman, there's an order that should be preserved, right? And so there's some, maybe they're porous, but there's some boundaries somewhere there. There should be maintained somehow, at least in this.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is all written with the assumption that there is an Islamic purity law that should be followed. But it's just, do you see it in the regulation of the city? And he doesn't go around saying, watch out for the Christians, or that sort of thing. Really, when the thing about the Christians in the bathhouse, what's the problem? The Christian women are sitting in a more honourable place. It's not like, oh, don't touch them.
There's this implicit hierarchy that they should.
Yeah, so that's a political, I would say, rather than a purity.
There's this, Kevin Reinhardt has written about Islamic purity laws, impurity, no danger,
Yeah.
claiming that this theory doesn't explain well.
Yeah. And I think this thing about being in power and regulating a complex urban civilization, it means that perhaps you can't be too fussy. The Shia, the minority, are much more fussy about purity law. And so there maybe you can make comparisons with like Jews in Christian Europe, where purity regulation, obviously it's inherited from the past, but it also has a meaning in terms of creating this idea of a pure community that is to be contrasted with the infidel outsiders. So for the Shia, the Sunni majority are also problematic in terms of their purity status.
Angela, and then
Yes, I was going to ask about the role of women in running bathhouses. Since I've been recently involved with reading Artemius, and we have a couple of women that are attested to be running the bathhouses, even alone or with their husband. And I was wondering if that happens in Islam, and whether people ever end up living in the bathhouse, which also sounds strange, but it's in Artemius as well. So I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah, so there's a huge amount of literature on bathhouses that I haven't got to the bottom of. A lot of it's later, and a lot of it's art historical or archaeological, and so I haven't found enough social history of bathhouses as that I want. But there might be things out there that I don't know about. Women obviously own property, and women are capitalists as well in their own right in this context. So I don't know specifically about bathhouses, but I wouldn't be surprised. Whether they run bathhouses, I don't know, it's a different question.
Well, it was a surprise to me to come across it, and
Yeah.
I'm sure it's not a surprise to the Xantimists who deal with that text all the time, but for me, it was kind of a surprising thing to think about, especially since she had to stay there overnight.
Yeah,
Are they publicly owned or
private,
privately?
yeah.
They're not public
For
facilities.
profits, no, they're private and for profit, and you're paying an entry fee to get in. Yeah, there are also texts like Waqf documents from Cairo from a bit later that say things like, and all of the Sufis who belong to this Sufi lodge will get a silver coin once every week to go to the bathhouse, or once a month to go to the bathhouse, so that even when it's like a facility for the righteous, it's still within the capitalist economy.
But some were endowed, right? For-
Yeah,
In
yeah.
Jerusalem.
there's a Khan that had a walk, a Khan Klein that had a walk later. But,
And a big hammam in Jerusalem.
also, yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, he didn't say, Ibn al-Khua says they shouldn't go, women shouldn't go in general, but that seems to be for issues of morality. But clearly there are, if
Yeah.
there are, Barclays is 4 women, and clearly there's enough women going. And he just says, and he says they should go after birth, right? So clearly there's not an issue from, you know, that's, well, I don't know, discharge, vaginal discharge, or whatever. Yeah, they'd be wrong.
Thanks. It's a question, it's a clarification, sorry, question, a clarificatory question. You read this text essentially with a distinction between the political order and ritual purity, and there's kind of two different, and I'm interested in that distinction. So
Yeah.
is that because in your context, people don't describe the political order in terms of ritual purity? And if so, is that common? I mean, is that unexpected, I suppose, or?
They do. No, the political order definitely is crucial to guaranteeing Muslims to carry out all of the strictures of Islam, including purity. This is a terminology I'm not very happy with because, but I think I think, you know, we should problematize our use of purity, because where do we get it from? I think we sort of use it reflexively a bit. And I think probably, so Douglas starts off talking about Leviticus, and I think, that the anthropological discussion of purity probably starts with an assumption that there is something called ritual purity, and then extends it from contexts that are familiar, so biblical context, without necessarily saying, is this a useful, is it a useful term? Another way, you know, because you could do a philological way would just be start with halal and haram. What does that mean? And put a taxonomy of all the things that come under halal and haram, which would be a lot of human life, right?
Right.
It would be politics, it would be morality, it would be, and, you know.
It's ordering the world the way God wants it to.
Yeah, and so so there's, you know, that the word, I guess, when I'm saying purity, I was trying to restrict myself to the very material sense of, you know, yeah, praxis, I guess, that and material interaction. But that's difficult to actually maintain given the material. So, you know.
So actually, I'm confused.
Yeah.
What you began with purity, and
Yeah.
if I understand you correctly, you were speaking about ritual purity,
Yeah,
which does not have the moral dimension as far as I understand it. Being impure, ritually impure, is not being immoral. And then you go to halal and haram, which are obviously moral categories. So can you wrap this up once more? I'm sorry if I
no,
haven't
I
understood.
thought I was trying to explain just that I find these very problematic categories, both in English and in Arabic. And so I'm speaking to an audience of non-Arabists, so I wouldn't start going, well, I guess I could have translated all of the meanings of halal into English.
Permitted and
terms.
forbidden, right?
Yeah, you could do, right? Yes, but then, so ritual impurity, the name of this conference is purity, right? So I think this does relate, I mean, well, how would you define purity?
Oh, boy.
In
Really
English,
sad. Ritual. It's whether you're allowed to engage in ritual or you're not.
but so what
And
about?
you can
what-
wash off your impurity very easily and pray or read and touch the Quran if you're a menstruating woman, or perform the.
But there's also a political conception of purity too, and a spatial, like Arabia as a pure land and Mecca as a haram and those sorts of things. I'm not sure, I don't think it's as simple to divide those levels as you're saying.
Okay.
right?
I agree.
Halal, there's a lot of things under halal, right?
That's what-
Including the material. There is a material aspect to the halal, and there's a spiritual aspect and a political aspect.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
But anyway, I agree that it's not, I don't think I reached a necessarily perfect point at the end.
No, but thank you for raising the problematics.
Yeah, I thought it would be
Yes.
useful to talk about the problematic of the terminology that we're all engaging in.
Right,
So,
right, yes. Thank you.
yeah.
Angela?
Yes,
Yes.
I do have a handout and
Okay, so
I'll split it maybe in half. We can sort of left for it. Oh, yeah. Want me to do this for the table and then?
Yes, yeah, we're not after that.
okay,
There should be enough.
I'm happy to
Thank you,
present,
Jenny.
Angela.
Next question, so this is-
Yeah.
I got one. There's only one, is there? They're not.
There's one handout, right?
Just one,
Okay,
yeah.
okay,
but
take
it's
that
the-
passage.
okay.
Thank you.
Can I present Angela while the handout? is-
Yeah.
I don't think any of it reached this part of the room, right? Order, yeah. Yes,
I will.
okay.
Yeah, wait.
We should. Ed, you have one?
Yeah, you're right.
Um,
I think.
thank you. Okay, Angela Zielinski Kinney is a classical philologist and medievalist, currently based at the University of Vienna, where she's part of the research team for the ERC project Sunday Observance in Late Antiquity. This project also studied the apocryphal letter of Jesus Christ from heaven, concerning which the volume is forthcoming very soon. And Angela has written a substantial portion of this volume, including a new analysis of the Latin tradition, really a fascinating story about which I've heard from Angela several times while we've spent the year together here at the center. Yes. Angela's previous publications include a niche edition of the Latin Vulgate Bible for the Dumbarton Oaks Medieval Library, and as well as articles on late antique and medieval hagiography and epistolography. And
What's that?
no, I don't think so.
What do you want
She
to
needs
build that
to-
little?
I
at
just
the
think
bar?
it needs to go back to the start and fix the settings,
keeps
because
Auto playing.
she just needs to change the slideshow settings, so she needs to get out of this and have the controls.
So escape, right?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, if you get rid of timings there,
I just need to stop auto explaining.
it should be.
Sorry, I froze the timing.
In
Do you
the,
want to hide the bar?
on the top, Daniela, there. Those little checked boxes,
Yes, yes.
Do you want to do it? or should-
Uncheck use time.
Where's
Yeah.
the one?
that should
All
stop
of
it.
them, and play narration.
You're.
If you, yeah, check that, that should stop it moving itself.
Sorry.
Okay. Now is it gonna go? Okay. Shall I
Back to
start
the slideshow?
from beginning?
Yes.
Okay. Does it work all right from here?
This.
Okay, sorry. please. Did you finish? I don't.
Yeah.
I wasn't.
Yes. Yes, you can.
Okay, so thank you very much. Obviously want to thank the IIAS and every member of my group for a wonderful 9 months of studying this topic, and I'm excited to see how my work has progressed. And if you hear something that sounds familiar, don't worry, it has progressed actually. But a special thanks to Yitzhak and to Yannick, who both are incredibly patient and kind. I owe them many hours of proofreading or whatever they want me to do in the future. So caring for souls and bodies, offsetting pollution with aristocratic piety. A quick note, I'm going to use the PowerPoint for a while, and I've given you this handout not to scare you, but at some point I'm going to move to the handout just because there's a lot of text. So there's one thing that unites all religions and philosophies across time periods. The human body is a problem. It's fragile, flawed, and fated to die. And every major belief system has to deal with the body and its uncontrollable nature. The messages are often rife with contradictions. The human body is a wonder of creation. It's corrupt. It's a temple. It's a temptation. Its perfect resurrection is a key part of the Christian gospel, but in the meantime, imperfect bodies falter, fail, and fall ill. Illness and bodily weakness are both in antiquity and today subject to judgment. A sick body possesses coordinates that situate it somewhere between fate and fault. Illness may be a punishment. It may be an indication of sin, a test of faith, a sign of carelessness, the result of an overzealous lifestyle. It marks one out, it others. Today, I'm going to examine the depiction of indigent sick people. And I've chosen two letters from Jerome, late antiquity's favorite ascetic curmudgeon, and both were written at the end of the 4th century. So these letters are linked by numerous features, and that's why I've chosen them for this study. I think we're gonna go back. Okay, so the occasion of the letters is the same. They are consolations on the deaths of two different aristocratic women across among the circle of Jerome's closest friends. There's a hospital mentioned, so both mention a foundation of a hospital or hospice for poor or travelers. If it's possible to dim the lights a little bit, it might be easier with the PowerPoint, but if not, I'll also.
I think it says on or off.
Yeah, okay, never mind, I guess. There's a catalog. Masses of indigent sick people are described at length in the form of a descriptive catalog. The catalogs are not identical. There's a quotation, both quote an ominous inexpressibility topos. I'll say a bit about that later. And finally, there is praise, of course, because it's a eulogy, encomium, and his friends are praised. I'm going to start this study by sketching the landscape of charitable medical care in a very brief form, before proceeding to the topic of Jerome's self-identification and particular brand of asceticism. These will inform the epistles themselves, and I will discuss then unnoticed borrowings from the Cappadocian Fathers, and end by assessing Jerome's message in the light of his own personal agenda. So first, the hospitals. In the interest of time, I'm just going to go through this quickly. The background of these organizations has been discussed by a number of scholars, but Mark Allen Anderson has a definition that I find quite useful. An early hospital, hospice, or shelter was a namespace that was dedicated to extended care of the needy. A named space. Sorry, I don't know. Should be more seamless. So the definitions: a named space denotes a physical structure in late antiquity called by a specific phrase or word. And by using this type of terminology, individuals can demarcate spaces dedicated for the care of the poor and set them apart from other or older concepts of charity, and then create tangible expression of charitable efforts. Every hospital in Allen's catalog is also described as providing a certain amount of care, at the very least food and a place to rest. Even the simplest institution had food and a permanent staff member, and you got a bed. And you could stay there for an extended period of time. You could have a small mat or a more comfortable bed. Sometimes you could stay for just one night, but other people stayed for years and ended up working there. This aspect of extended care sets hospitals apart from charities such as diaconii, in which food, money, and goods were collected and redistributed to the poor. Finally, all hospitals, according to Anderson's definition, were charitable institutions. So no guest ever had to pay for their care or room. In some cases, they even got some gift money when they left. That would be nice today. So thus, late antique hospitals can be distinguished from inns as well as from private physicians who would see patients at home or charge for their services. Anderson then compiled a list of terms that fit this definition of hospital. I'm just gonna show these on the screen. There are more, and in other languages, we don't have any time for that. But there are approximate English equivalents, so different types of specialty hospitals, orphanage, baby hospitals, things like that. Of these, the two words that appear in my pair of letters are nosocomion and xenodokion. So I'm going to talk about those two specifically. The nosocomion is a place for the care of the sick. It accounts, Anderson does a kind of graph that I just reproduced here of how many hospitals were founded in each century. He has a larger point that I'm not going to mention right now, but the nosocomion is this responsible for the second largest number of late antique institutions that he categorizes. And these provided care for people with all kinds of illnesses. This was specifically for illness. It dates quite early, but the noun form, the nosocomion, first appears in the 4th century, and Basil of Caesarea himself uses it to define his own hospital complex. In many monasteries, the nosocomion seems to have been for the members of the monastic community, and there was a separate xenodokion that was for the outsiders. Outside of monasteries, nosocomia were standalone hospitals. The second term that appears in this pair of letters is the xenodokion, and that's the place for reception of strangers. It has a really long and complex classical history, but this type of hospice accounts for about half of Anderson's examples. And it underwent a significant switch, and that's all I'm going to mention here, is that in short, classical xenones and xenodokia were not dedicated to the poor, they were commercial enterprises. And if a wealthy citizen or an official were not charged for their stay, then a return favor would be expected. So like, I stay at your house, then you let me stay, then I let you stay at my house, sort of thing. The earliest attestation of Christian xenodokia, specifically for the poor, is in Theophanes of Constantinople, who writes that Constantine provided grain for the poor in the xenodokia of Antioch during the famine of 331 and 332. Yeah, and I would be remiss, I'm not going to talk about this example, but there is here the earliest known Jewish example of a xenon is here in Jerusalem, so I just wanted to put it up here. And it's a Greek inscription in a cistern to the south of the Temple Mount. Here the water facilities probably refer to mikvah, but it is a little bit disputed. And this hospice is clearly intended, is founded in a Jewish context and intended for strangers in need, and is dated centuries before the first Christian attestation of its xenodokion for the needy, which occurs in the 4th century. Yes. The greatest increase, however, in the attested charitable shelters and hospitals occurred in conjunction with the spread of Christianity, perhaps. And in this context, Julian, the emperor and successor, whose uncle Constantius made these famous comments. I'm not going to read them out loud, but how do I get rid of this?
Minimize it.
Yeah. There we go. His famous comments about how the pagans don't hold a candle to Jews and Christians when it comes to charity. However, despite Julian's call to action, there's no evidence that the followers of traditional Roman religion ever stepped up. So this is all I want to say about late antique hospitals, but I think you'll find it useful as we discuss Jerome's letters. A little bit about Jerome, that he was a man of extremes is known to everyone in this room, and his various roles are all infused with this particular personality of his. But he was indisputably a tastemaker of the late 4th and early 5th centuries. He took care for his own personal image, changing his own failures into triumphs and fashioning his own persona to fit the circumstances. But beyond that, he was also an influencer, a skillful persuader of others. He sold many aristocrats on the notion of extreme asceticism. His focus on aristocratic wealthy women brought him no small measure of scandal, but it seemed to also result in a certain amount of success. There's been a lot of ink spilled on dissecting the contradictions of Jerome. Right now, it's pretty trendy to revolt against the previous pious depictions of Jerome. and find malice or manipulative intent in every single sentence he wrote. I ask how much of this manipulation is just the result of his facility with rhetoric and his desire to impress. He writes to his audience, after all, we have to remember that. He wouldn't have had an audience if he had only been hostile to everybody. But it's just to remind you that my discussion today takes place not in a world of black and white moral judgments, but in these kind of gray mists of literary history and philological sporting, and also just the agenda that everybody had. Every person of high rank in late antiquity played power games to keep or enhance their status. The question was not whether you played, but rather how and where. The idea of attaining a kind of celebrity within society of the church was one that appealed to Jerome. That is the path he took, and his letters repeatedly refer to his own reputation and those of others. So in the discussion of the illness and hospitals of these two epistles, which I'll go into detail soon, there are four parts to this section of paper, and okay, so first I'm going to talk about Jerome's asceticism and theology of choice. This will be short. Then discussing these two letters. Finally, I want to identify source material that has not been identified before except by me in oral talks, Cappadocian source material, and then finally a bit of analysis of the self-serving turn. So that's the outline for the rest of. Yes. So Jerome's monastic, the first thing I want to talk about is his self-identification, and Jerome's monastic asceticism allows him to claim to be poor. And that's interesting because he was not poor. He actually claims that he is in need of assistance much more than normal poor people. And this is evident if you take a look at the Contra Vigilantium, where he argues against the opinion that alms should help the local church instead of being shipped off to Jerusalem. And I'll just let you read these, but he wants the alms to go to Jerusalem. And why? He has a horse in the race. He has an agenda. Alms sent to Jerusalem help finance his own monastery and later hospice, hostel for travelers. But how could he reasonably depict himself as poor or deserving of alms? He was wealthy. He voluntarily gave up his right to own property when he became a monk. Right. And the problem is that he has a distinction here that will be important for the later interpretation, and that is that there's an elite community of holy poor people, and these are separate from the common poor. I will translate here. As for those poor people with their tattered clothes and filthy bodies whom a raging lust dominates, are they able to have everlasting abodes, even though they possess neither present nor future prospects? That's really bleak, by the way. It is not simply the poor, but the poor in spirit who are called blessed. Of them it is written, blessed is he who gives thought to the poor and the needy. On the evil day, the Lord will deliver him. In aiding the poor of the common people, understanding is not what is needed, but rather alms. In the case of the holy poor, there is a blessed understanding that it be given to one who blushes when receiving and grieves once he has received, reaping material things while sowing spiritual things. It's the end. So according to Jerome, there are two categories of poor people. There are the isti pauperes, the common poor people, and they are dominated by their base sexual orgies. They don't have anything now, and because of their sin, they won't ever have anything. Not now, not in eternity. And then there are the sancti pauperes, the community of Christian ascetics. These are the poor in spirit, and he insidiously uses the beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, to emphasize that poverty alone does not entitle one to membership in the holy poor. One has to have the choice. Being poor is not enough. You have to choose to renounce the world. You have to have something and give it up in order to be deserving of alms. And so the holy poor form a sanitized version of poor people who conform to elite social norms in almost every way. They have noble families. They are well-mannered, they are educated, they blush, and they appreciate their donations more than actual poor people. Jerome's argument in the Contra Vigilantium is really commercial. It's good to give alms to the people who can give it back to you. And what are they giving back? The spiritual salvation for you. They'll pray for you. But you're not going to get that from the guy on the street. So Jerome's construction of an elite poor characterized by voluntary poverty without sacrifice of social status is at odds with the common poor who don't have any choice. And it's not known how poor these ascetics even were. I'll skip over the whole testimony about that, but it became a trope that aristocratic conversions must include a renunciation of wealth and embrace of poverty. But it didn't require you to give up everything, you just had to give up enough. And then you didn't have reduced social status that you would get if you were normal poor. You actually get famous and you get friends. So there's just, you can't lose anything. Why not? So this is the important background for these two letters. And now I'm going to move, sorry, I should go back one. I'm going to move the handout because I decided this is just too much text to put on the screen. I tried to bold things that were important, but in general, I just like to give you proof of what I'm saying. I see that I have about 13 minutes left if I'm right with the time here, so I think this is going to work just fine. About halfway through. So. Jerome wrote Epistle 66, a consolation to his friend Pamachius on the death of his wife. And this was written in 397. It is a letter that's packed with praise for the addressee and not really for his dead wife. So Jerome begins his letter, this is A1 on your handout, with medical allusions and analogies. His late consolation is likened to reopening an old wound and causing pain, and it sets a kind of medical tone for the rest of the letter. Curiously, in this analogy, the commemoration of Paulina is considered the counterpart to a cosmetic procedure. It's improving the appearance of a scar, which is something that I think I could unpack in the future, maybe. So their ascetic concerns remain a theme throughout the letter. Jerome imagines how Pamachius uses the deceased Paulina's luxuries for charity. This is A2 on your handout. But basically, this epistle has a disappearing woman problem. Paulina is not really talked about. Her stuff is talked about, and her stuff is given away for charity. And then Jerome, in portions that I haven't copied here, says, well, Paulina would be happy about that. Her participation in donating this stuff is posthumous, she didn't have any actual role in doing it. But what is interesting here is in A2 on your handout, there is a countless number of sick people that Pamachius has helped by founding a Tsendokium, a hospice for strangers at Porto with Fabiola, and that's the subject of the next letter. So a parade of ill and disabled people are described and then stamped with poetic topos, the inexpressibility topos from Virgil known as the many mouths motif. And here you can, yes, you can see, I'll just say a few parts of the doors, which of old poured forth masses of visitors, are now beset only by the wretched. One swollen with dropsy is pregnant with death. Another is mute and speechless and without the means to beg, and he begs all the more, even though he can't really beg. And this one, maimed from his youth, beseeches alms, but not for himself. Another rots from the king's evil and lives, though his body has become a corpse. Not if I had 100 tongues and 100 mouths, could I recount all the names and types of suffering. The scene, which could have been described with compassion of sick people coming to the northeast, becomes instead a crowd of monstrous people, monsters, thronging the doors. And as if the gruesome descriptions were not enough, Jerome uses a classical topos associated with hell to further characterize the poor and sick as other. And these negative emotions contained in the Virgilian many mouths cliché have been explored by Stephen Hines and his influence with both original intertext. But basically it is a negative topos, it is not positive. So here we have Jerome describing the torments that the indigent sick suffer on earth. And given his description of the unenlightened poor in other contexts, we know that he already believes these sufferers are probably beyond spiritual redemption. The quotation inserts poetic distance, so the reader is inclined to view the catalog as a rhetorical and narrative device, like the catalog of ships in the Iliad, but the worst is yet to come, and this is A3 on your handout. I don't know if maybe we want to put the lights up to make people a little, I'm sorry about the combination of PowerPoint and handout. So A3 on your handout says he goes out, that means Pamachius, accompanied by this army, and then he cherishes Christ, he is washed white by their squalor. As one who gives James to the poor and a candidate of the needy, thus he hastens to heaven. And this is the most brazen dehumanization of all, is that these sick people and their filth make Pamachius clean. The miserable wretches of this narrative are there just to elevate their elite rich benefactor. Jerome has this praise that is woven with kind of threads of disgust. So there's several concepts that I could mention here. Some I couldn't even find precise words or phrases. I just started to write down some things to say. One is maybe saviorism. We would say maybe today talking about white saviorism, but here just in general, I think saviorism. Jerome is describing a situation in which somebody achieves sainthood or holiness by dealing with somebody else's filth. So I am holy because you are disgusting and I'm helping you. And I thought also of a kind of comparison that elicits beauty, a type of beauty infoglyph, maybe like, this is beautiful because this is ugly. I don't know, these are concepts I hope to continue to develop a bit more. But Jerome's physical and even this poetical distance from the masses of the sick poor represents dignity, but his own dignity and the indignity of the sufferers. So there's a lot of work that can be done on the intertextuality of Epistle 66 and some other texts, like there's an account of Paulinus of Nola, and then there's Prudentius Parastephanon 2 in honor of Lawrence. These both also have this funerary feast that are described. And there they are also, these poor sick people are also described in grisly terms, but they are also called the treasures of Christ. That does not happen in Jerome. There's no guarantee for the poor there. The second letter that I wanted to discuss also has a similar catalog, and as I said, the other connections in terms of the content and the reason for the letter. And this will be number 2 on your handout, the next page. In Jerome's eulogy for his dear friend Fabiola, also Pamachius' friend, the indigent poor are described in a similar fashion. So in, B1, sorry about that. These passages, yes, are linked by the things I mentioned earlier. So the first thing that Fabiola did was found a nosocomium. There's a little bit of a problem with the Latin here. Some manuscripts have primo, or whether this is prima. Prima omnium would mean she was the first one to do it, that she was the first one and to found a nosocomium. And the other interpretation would be, and the first thing she did was to institute, to found a hospital. I'm not sure, I'm a little bit torn on it. There are reasons for both interpretations. It is interesting here that we have untransliterated Greek. This is exactly how it is in the edition. So she founded this into which she might gather sufferers out of the streets. And here we have another catalog, and this is a grosser catalog. I won't read it all completely, you can read it yourself. But I will list a little bit. The briefly details of these people that are included here induce the reader to view these as something other and unhuman. But this time we have not just normal injuries and sicknesses. We have a few additional things that seem like mutilations or judicial punishments. So we have a nose that's slit or cut off. This is done on purpose. This is not an accident. And it was a punishment that we have testimony of for slaves and adulterers getting this punishment. Blinding doesn't have a legal precedent as a punishment in the Roman world, but we have testimonia that said people were tortured or punished by blinding, just not in a legal sense. So Galen is one person who sees slaves getting their eyes gouged out. Then we have Semiustos Pedes, half burnt feet. So I've done some work on this. It calls to mind torture or maybe ordeals. It's true that actual legally binding or more official ordeals were much more common in the medieval period, but there are scattered testimony in antiquity for ordeal by fire or tests or trials, holiness, both pagan and Christian alike, especially with regard to celibacy. So this cluster of injuries suggests that some of the hospital patients were not normal. They were slaves, not just normal poor people, but rather slaves or criminals. They had some additional baggage, and they distanced themselves even further from the normal audience for this letter, which would be the elite Christian leadership. So it's perhaps interesting to take a break here before I move to the sources that I found for Jerome. We see here that he's treating realia and made from the lives of Pamachius and Fabiola. They both had to have done this thing. They had to have founded or been involved in founding these hospitals. This is not in question. The establishment of the hospitals is, in fact, a praiseworthy thing that they did. But these are kind of surface level observation. It might seem strange that I even have to say that. But beneath the floorboards, I think there's some tension. There's like a triangulation. Jerome is a strong proponent that you have to do alms. But he wants them sent to Jerusalem for reasons that are at least partially selfish. And the money used for these charity hospitals was money that they didn't send to Jerusalem. So he has some strong opinions about who is worthy of these alms and the finances. It's not just enough to be poor or sick, but his friends then went and established these hospitals that might in fact be at odds with what Jerome would have preferred to have happen. But they have to be praised, right? Their decisions have to be somehow justified. And then Jerome takes steps to redirect towards another agenda that actually he believes in more, or you might say serves him better. And in Fabiola's case, this redirection is achievable through her reference to other charitable acts. She actually visited Jerome in Jerusalem briefly, and then they got into like a fight and he left. In Pamachius's case, Jerome asks almost tactlessly after praising him, and I'm not going to read all of it, but he says at the very end of the Pamachian letter, I, for my part, am building in this province a monastery and a hospice close by, so that if Joseph and Mary could chance to come to Bethlehem, they might not fail to find shelter and welcome. Then he says, I don't have enough money. I didn't sufficiently count the cost of my tower and all of this. So he's begging, but I just thought that was a kind of funny way to end. So finally, I want to end by saying a little bit about these catalogs and where the sources come from, and hopefully I'll end. Fine, I've been watching. So, why were the human beings portrayed like this by Jerome when we know he's capable of compassionate accounts? Well, I've given you some reasons why. But when I was looking at these catalogs, I thought he had to have taken inspiration from a text. We have a quotation that is stamped with a dismal poetic pathos. I discussed this in other work I've done. I just thought he didn't make these things up somehow, not completely anyway, and I couldn't find it in Latin literature, but I was looking in the wrong place, so I found sources in Greek literature. So these are just the catalogs compared that I tried to summarize what types of injuries there were or what diseases. We have jaundices in both of them. There's not a lot of overlap because 66 is so short. But a parallel for all of these injuries and diseases can be found in Gregory of Nyssa's 2 homilies on loving the poor, and that's C and D. I'm going to find out. I've just given these to you mostly as evidence. I'm not going to read them out loud. But there are some general references in Gregory's first homily, where we have mutilated members and amputated feet and how they're creeping along. And this is C1 on your handout, but the second one is really where we get going. So I just checked and I took the first homily, the De Beneficientia, and I highlighted the things that were overlapping, but there wasn't a lot of overlap. But let's take a look at the second one, and there's quite a lot more. This is the second one. It has another title, but it's on loving the poor, more or less. And I've highlighted here, and I just want to show you how many things that we can find in that catalog. And there's quite a bit more. So I've given you the passages as well. And I'm just going to talk general and then end. So Gregory of Nyssa was involved in the Cappadocian charity project, where there was a giant hospital complex that was built by Basil of Caesarea and continued by his friends and relatives after his death. So Gregory's homilies talk about why they did this, and there's some new work that this was mostly for lepers, but I think there's evidence for a variety of sick people using it. Why would Gregory use these dramatic descriptions that I say are so uncompassionate or incompassionate of Rome? Well, Gregory is talking about how the sick poor feel compelled to parade their diseases as a shock device and get their, the means to live. But with the charity project of the great hospital, this is not as necessary. There's a place for them and is integrated into the community. If you take a look at Gregory of Nyssa, you will find that he's repeatedly said, do not separate these people from the normal people of God. Do not seek to put these people away from you. You are meant to help them, and that is your role. And if you put them away from you and ignore them, you are sinning, you are transgressing. It's clear that Jerome knew these homilies and that his description of Tamachius and Fabiola's charity work drew upon the depiction of disease that is contained there, but he twists it in the opposite direction. On B2 in your handout for Jerome, you will find he gives what do I want to say? As if somebody were accusing him of not following Basil's lead in charity. He says, I know of many wealthy and devout people who are unable to overcome their natural repugnance to sights and perform this work of mercy by agency of others who give money instead of personal aid. I don't blame them. I pardon the squeamishness of people who can't look upon these people without wanting to vomit. He pardons them, gives them absolution. Jerome notes that the elites can't stand to look at these people, but Gregory in his own, you will find the place where he is responding to is D3 on your handout from Gregory. But you say it's hard to master the loathing that most people naturally feel in the face of the sick. Truly, I'm of your opinion. It's hard, but I'm saying it's worthy. You should do it. That God commands this. So it's a direct response. I think there's no question that he knew this homily and he was preliminarily defending himself against it. To conclude, I won't take any longer. I wanted to just end with a few remarks about how I'm approaching this material and a couple of final questions for you. Maybe you have them, but this is the flow part of basically how I see these two letters that Jerome's friends used well to establish hospitals. In the background is this Cappadocian model of charity for the indigent sick. And Jerome knows he can draw on that to write these encomium. Both of these things, both Jerome and the Cappadocians think that when we think of our own potential fate, we can have compassion for other people. Remarkable. Then there's also the problem that rich Christians have to give away something in order to be seen as Christian. And it's okay to give money if sick people make you nauseated. Well, that's only Jerome. That's not the Cappadocian model, but he has to somehow justify that. And Jerome's views then take the people you might give the money to, the real poor, and says, well, in fact, give it to me instead. Don't make another hospital, but rather send your things to Jerusalem, to the holy poor. That's me, the monk. And the poor sick are probably going to hell. But I'm just going to imply that with my quotation from Virgil twice in 2 different letters. And that's how I'm going to implicitly suggest that they're not worthy. So these are all in the background. I guess I can't say it's really a flow chart, but it's more that these are all the milieu. And that's, yeah, I'm open for your comments and questions as I continue this work. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you very much. I absolutely love that paper. I thought it was excellent. A few comments, interesting that you might want to take notes. John Chrysostom, who also built some hospitals, he tells his audience that they need to build or devote a room in their house to be a xenodocheo. So there's these 2 aspects, namely, let's call it public hospitality, because of course it comes from hospitality. The hospital, all of this, it's rooted in ancient practices of hospitality. So there's public hospitality, which are these that you mentioned, the hospitals, but then there's private hospitality. And it seems from Chrysostom that people are okay with public hospitality because it's the church's problem. But it's the private hospitality, caring for the sick and the poor in your home, which seems to be a problem for a lot of the people, because maybe they don't want sick individuals to come into their house.
Yes.
But then, of course, the counter argument is that based on hospitality in the ancient Mediterranean, why is hospitality such an important virtue? Is because it could be God or an angel who visits you. And in early Christian discourse, every visitor, every xenos, every stranger is a representative of Christ. So the poor, why is their filth and their worms and these descriptions of their bodies, why is it actually inverted to be purified? Because the poor are representatives of Christ, because in Matthew, Christ says, I was naked, you didn't clothe me, I was hungry, you didn't feed me. So I wonder whether the association of the poor and the sick with Christ, and Christ as a sort of a purifying presence in the context of ancient customs and cultures of hospitality, might help us to understand why this language, and then of course, the more extreme you make the rhetoric, the more you drive your point across. I mean, I don't think that all of the poor look like this. We know that these are constructions, literary and discursive constructions of the poor that have a very important function in order to move people to adopt certain attitudes and behaviors.
I think I do agree with you. I think though that there is a point that Gregory, I had to look more into Chrysostom. So thank you for that, and also for this vision of public-private. But I also
which I'll think to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted to just say that
Sorry.
there was something by Gregor Nyssa that also mentioned how people get overwhelmed by the number of sick and diseased people, but these sick and diseased people stick together because they help each other out.
Yeah.
So if you are blind, but somebody else can not walk, you can work together to, one might not have good members, somebody else's. I mean, it is a parade of diseases, but in Gregory Nyssa's homily, he describes them as a compassionate group for each other, and he admonishes his congregation, why are you not helping them too? But I think that in Gregory Nissa's view, they are just desperate too, because they need things to survive. And I can't imagine being sick in antiquity, like in a real severe way or mutilated was fun.
This is hyperbole, right? I mean, it's the extreme rich on the one hand and the very, very, very.
So that's what makes it so offensive with Jerome. I mean, I don't want to read like so emotionally into him all the time, but it is very insidious what he says.
And I think the idea of sort of the private xenophilia and also aspects of this problem within the household, because we should also remember before the rise of the hospital, healthcare was practiced in the household. It was a domestic issue. And so this might be a sign and a symptom of this transition of healthcare practices from a domestic sphere, moving it towards this institutionalized hospital. But I absolutely agree with what you say. It's really, I learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment.
Other questions or comments?
There's a booster there.
Oh, yes. go.
Thank you, Angela. Very, very interesting. Couple of small questions. So first of all, the chart you showed about the amount of hospitals and the jump you showed in the 6th century. So I was wondering if you can explain it by the increase of pilgrimage to the Holy Land or monastic, because you said there are few types of hospitals, and one of them is for monastic purposes. And my other question is about Jerome's renunciation of wealth. I was under the impression that he didn't give away his entire fortune. I have in mind his letter to his brother after the sack of Rome, when he asked him to sell their property because, the barbarians are coming and there's an inflation or something. And my question, I guess, is, did people know that? I mean, is it strictly the addressee of the letter? Like, is it strictly rhetorical because he wasn't for like anything?
I think he was just really good at presenting himself, whatever it is that he wanted to present himself. But actually, in letter 66 at the end, when he asks for the money, he also says, "I asked my brother to go and sell these." So it's in letter 66, and I think there is another letter that mentions it as well. But he's even in the same breath as he says, "I told my brother to go sell all this land that we own," he still is basically asking Machias for money. So there's both. He's able to speak out of both sides. It is not that one. So whether Machias, Machias is insanely rich as well. They had a private shrine in their house with painted. That's a whole thing I didn't have time to talk about, but they are the richest of the rich. And so maybe he thought Machias just won't care. He understands, I want money will be sent,
The letter 66 does he mention why he asks his brother to renounce or sell their fortune?
Yes, he says that he had started building this hospice and monastery project, and that he had not properly, makes a biblical reference, and said that he had not properly counted up the cost of the tower he wished to build. So I think this is also in another letter pertaining to Paula at some point, but it's in 66 as well, at the end, right at the end. About the jump, for this you'll have to look at Mark Anderson's dissertation. I'm not sure if he's then published a book with this information. This sort of information is always being expanded upon, but I found it quite helpful to see, and I was interested, so I put this in there. But as far as pilgrimage, driving it, it's hard to say. Yeah, we'll have to talk about it because I'm not sure.
Final question?
This is a really boring medieval historian question, but I'm going to ask anyway. you raised yourself, actually, the question of the manuscripts. Let me just ask a question, because your paper is really arguing, as if I understood it right, that this, where Jerome seems to be being compassionate and so on towards, he's really not, right? He's kind of, it's actually an unsympathetic portrayal of the wretched and the poor. And I wondered whether there's anything in the manuscripts which would help support that interpretation, that that's how it's read, as in, is it this letter copied with other, presumably it's just made with other Jerome letters, or is it sometimes copied with other texts about poverty?
Well, the problem is that the Fabiola letter especially is extremely long and it has many other aspects to it. So when if you were to read the entire eulogy for Fabiola, you would get kind of a huge picture of her. Sorry, go ahead.
No, so it's buried in this long text.
Yes. Jerome was always controversial. I'm not sure that anyone. Let's put it this way: the audience reading these letters, how much are they going to actually care if he doesn't like poor people? Do they like poor sick people? I mean, I'm sorry to be a bit skeptical about it, but it's just I don't know that that's the point. The point for them is to indulge in there's a literary aspect to this that cannot be ignored and is being ignored most of the time with Jerome's letters. There's a literary enjoyment of this catalog that is punctuated then by a Virgilian quotation that brings you back into a poetic spirit. So you're not meant to really think about them as real people, but rather say, wow, that woman went and had pus on her and she didn't care and she is so holy. That's basically, I mean, that's my opinion. But I'm working on a written version of this, which I hope will be a little bit easier to comprehend. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all. Yaniv, we reconvene in quarter of, yes.
I'm guessing it's, early manuscripts are 9th, 8th, the Carolingian, right? Or am I wrong? I don't know.
I have to check. Yeah, I did write that there are manuscripts with Primo and
Yeah, exactly. That's what
I mean, but I haven't done a lot of manuscript tradition of Jerome. Actually, I mean, as much as I'm interested in Jerome, didn't have investigating in manuscript tradition. I haven't gone for it. I think it's quite other things that they've been coming with a lot of but I can't be sure about that because I'm also trusting what everybody else is saying.
Well, that's it. I don't know. Some letter collections are copied as such, right?
Yes,
Most
that's right.
probably are.
You're right.
But occasionally you get these, they're reconstructed by people because it's different places and I see it.
So for this, you can look at, I think, well, I don't know. There is some listed and on letter 108, but that kind of categorizes the types of letters and whether they travel together. But I haven't double checked that, and I
Ultimately, whether this affects your reading what Jerome was saying, I don't know. I guess it's later reception.
So these two letters would be with other enthusiastic letters.
Yeah.
And probably what you're mentioning is that these are, these were great.
Yeah, that's the point, isn't it? It's not. Yeah.
You know, and we can't even say they weren't great women.
Yeah.
Suggest that very interesting. So
I'm skeptical about that too, I must say. Okay, yeah.
But I do find California, like what the type of or like something you can have that but I can't
You will make some medieval legalists, so it's very sad. You can show this is another Roman practice.
I'm not thing, I'm not giving it up again, but I do want to follow my lead. But I think Senator Houston was a very interesting way of putting it. Suggesting, and I know that maybe sort of more deals. That's why I'm out for talk to her. Yeah. I mean, why else would it's been worked out? Yeah.
I'm also a little skeptical, though. It would be very interesting if that is what was planned, because that would presuppose that the person had failed their office, right? Because if the person had succeeded, their people were.
But I mentioned it because I I mean, the other, but there's something.
So they had.
I am curious about it because I think from the, I may be misremembering. I think the walking on iron comes very late in the details. I don't know.
So far, that there are some practices that are.
No, I don't think it's also not pretty sure.
I forgot if it's. I forgot.
So, yeah.
No. So the note being split in these and like the jobs, I but they're
If you got specific thing for yourself.
especially if it's meant to be Beyonce, they are not die.
Anyway, thank you. I thought I should say myself.
Davis is here. Yeah, this is what I say. Well, no, I think exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, well.
She, I guess, sent one radar and it was questions. She wasn't with it, detonated secretly.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I just was expecting like coming in, like. Okay, barely. Right, but I mean, like, when I tell you, they didn't really match face to support. They really do. Like, I mean, okay, damn it, you stop to see it a valid US passport, that it was made.
Yeah.
Interesting. I was surprised. They were just so.
It's not for lack of trying. No, not at all.
Yeah, I mean, I was on that lot.
No, it's not Angela, with regular.
No, I was not. I was there. I could not appear. What if they do?
They got put on this. They make with.
I must have quite I realized that Jerome knew a specific style of Gregory of Nazianz. But you do you know about any other from Gregory of
Well, she finish out her. You know, it's a but she I know.
Say I'm gonna.
I know, especially I'm yeah. But you know, even if we want to leave it's not. And it's not so, yes, right? Local politics or something. And it's not. So right. You know, so he's planning to stay there. He's gonna stay, and she's just gonna. I don't think. That's what she. And it's sort of. It's just being a lot of. That's all. Not that I know. At their age, their parents question, but they don't they're always afraid of you. Yeah, I don't know. And as she, no, you explained it when you're. Anything, the parents, they're gonna do it.
Ah, yes, no.
Maybe it's not happening when we're married, but we're not interested. Yeah.
I can tell you later, so collect my thoughts.
That she did here for doing the first reading. It's with the basic context to, have you read through? Yeah. They owe you something.
I said last night, I'm looking forward to receiving from you your contribution to the volume that
That-
Roy has managed to finish his for, which he was boasting about just now.
I haven't written mine either, so I'm more sorry.
But your editor,
If I go there,
that one of.
no one will be able to see me. So I
Yeah,
can't-
once you write your options, no
Wow.
one's
It's very far. I found it more stressful.
And I have no PowerPoint, so
Oh,
there's
wow.
there's no
Yeah.
there's no focus.
Well, as well, because I've been writing things where I have bit the same ideas. You know, you write something, the same idea, a bit of it goes there, and
I know,
have this confusion about. Okay, 0031 629 128 665.
Yeah.
That's not my email anymore. You've been here. There was a strike, right? Yes. Have you been striking? Yeah. This is why. Otherwise, it would have to wait until. You can put this in your acknowledgement.
Yeah, you're right. Good.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Oh, that's no worries, no worries. Yeah. Oh, I've got something. Now. It's looking at just what I'm going to put aside of my. Yeah, so it's a picture of paradise, achievement. 7 layers. Problematic lot. I thought it would be at the top, but of course I think it's at the bottom. It's actually the first level. He's in the top place. Because it must be the top piece. Yeah. And then these are 12 figures here. Must be 12 figures. So if you see a picture like this where the bottom layer seems to be, that's definitely the top layer. Okay. Got green. Do you think this is? Yeah, I thought it's probably. Yeah, because I've never seen one in which these at the bottom rather than this is all right. Oh yes. Yeah. So this is he hasn't got up to the top yet. So this is on his first.
You want to see
But then these 12 figures. Yeah. Maybe that's a good
I didn't do a PowerPoint.
All right, okay.
This is probably a more natural place with bigger decisions. Sometimes, you know, it's.
That's right, yeah.
To be there, this is an angel, that's not far.
Yeah.
Going back.
Yeah.
And somebody's gonna need to get the tomorrow.
Yeah.
For Saturday, the talk.
Uh-huh.
Get to.
Here, straight?
It's in the.
Yes.
But I don't think anyone's ever
Yeah, sure.
written about it.
How are you planning on doing that? Okay, there's the train.
Yeah, I was thinking about it.
That might be best. Gotta ask.
I'll ask Yanni.
Yaniv or Debbie or Daniela. Yeah, but
I downloaded one of the apps.
the cab thing?
No, that's a property, no.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Finish at about 9.
Charles needs to tomorrow, go straight to the airport, roughly when you are going, from here. What is his best approach?
Okay, they need to order then a second cab, because we were already gonna squeeze in a third person in ours. I think that you and Ed should go down together then to the airport. If we're tomorrow. Yeah, we should just have them get another.
That's the other way of doing it.
Is everyone flying? There's a lot of people flying out tomorrow afternoon then.
Yeah.
I think there's 4 of you.
4. Could they get a cab? They could get a cab before, couldn't they? They just get a big.
Yeah, I
slightly
think they
bigger cab.
could if
Just
they
order a
try.
slightly bigger cab.
Yeah, I think Debbie was asking that. Yeah, if you're all going roughly at the same time, you might as well. I
Yeah.
mean, even if you have to sit in the airport for a
Yeah,
bit, you might as well go.
Yeah. And but it does mean, it also does mean that we're pretty much heading on. We're probably not going to stick around for lunch. In any meaningful sense. If it's sandwiches like it was already, if it was sandwiches
asked
like it
you
was
need to-
yesterday, then we just
You know what?
just grab a sandwich.
You know what?
Yeah.
Sit and think,
What time's your flight? Pile you all want.
That's true.
To London.
Yeah, London Luton.
I should ask him.
El Al to London Luton.
I also flying at 4:40, I think, but not to Luton, so again.
No, you see, the thing is, my car is, because I flew out on
I
EasyJet.
also flew on EasyJet.
I flew out on EasyJet, and my car is at Luton.
Yeah, back together. Yeah. Yeah, no, so I have to.
Flying back to the Heathrow Airport.
Yeah, but then actually up further from there, so.
Oh, I see, that's not a day, I think it wasn't going to Luton. No, I was in Cambridge or something, and then I came across.
Yeah.
Just went with LL, it's.
No, it's not
I'm
bad.
looking from the sea, I'm flying.
Oh, let's go by
I'm flying at 4:15.
All right.
Deborah, I'm flying at 4:15. Is that going to be an issue? We're going to have time on.
You only have
I'm not checking in luggage.
Exactly, then it's not a problem.
Yeah, I'll, you know, I'm not going to wear this watch as I go through security. All right, this is what caused me hassle.
I did it.
They have pretty sophisticated things there.
Well, no, this is because it has Arabic numerals in it.
Ah,
And then this was years ago that he noticed this watch. And he said, "Oh, Arabic numerals on your watch." And I said, yeah.
May I see?
Yeah.
I see, just like that.
Do you know
Oh, actually,
Arabic? And I said, yeah, I know Arabic. And he said, but why do you know Arabic?
Yeah.
But he eventually said, oh, right, okay. Oh, well, Al's just told me that it's open for check-in. And that will be his mom. I just need to talk with her about these things.
Oh, yeah, she will be. I was just wondering whether she was in here.
Oh, right, yeah. Because it will be like, it might be, she might run her.
We had to score, you know, I had her in New York. And the flight attendant said that other flights that didn't cancel, or, you know, like, they had to evacuate. So, just like some degree, you know, and then we get here and it's. I'm not going to say. That's why I said, I just wanted to.
And absolutely, yes, the word is right. Just call them a bunch of guys over and right now. In Arabic, John was very good try to figure out. That is right. Yeah, religious. Okay. You know, spread them. Why? Why don't you?
We do it online. I'm getting this vacation.
That's
No, it's
Thursday.
for that, yeah, the dance, they're meeting on Wednesday, Thursday. Yeah.
So, okay, everybody, let's grab our seat.
Right, the left one.
That was, you just.
I mean, I was.
So
You
ask
me
me,
ask you a
shall we
question,
see
no,
you,
that
Charles?
wasn't the intention, I was.
But you know, so don't look a gift horse.
Yeah, no, I said a chance. I was prepared, so I was gonna slog it out there on like, more than happy to get it access.
You know? If you're being offered largesse.
You accept, correct, really gratefully, like in the rest of Jerome.
Yes, except Jerome was neither humble nor
No?
grateful.
You too. Okay, well, that's Nathan. I mean, I will still be sad, missing the tour.
No, I just got told we get to have an armed guard for the tour.
Even better, even
Right,
better.
why? At the university, it's university policy.
And I'm,
They wouldn't let us go if they were worried about it, but if it's a university sponsored tour, they will not send you alone. But we never had.
that's interesting.
Do you not know what to say? I'm sure not.
Maybe everyone will be given a gun. Oh.
Yeah, that would be very useful for some.
Yeah.
That would not be self-defense, that would be a possibility.
Yes.
Harming lots of other people,
That's right.
arguably myself as well.
Yeah,
Yes, 2 machine guns, knife.
That's right.
Just crazy. We have an armed guard, it's pretty much like my grandmother's age.
But
I wandered around the old town on my own and. Yeah,
it's not the guy who did the versions to the university life.
No.
His name is Shy? No. Kyle, no. You know what it is.
Yes, but
Well, why can't you just carry the damn shit? I feel more comfortable with that.
don't worry, when he's down, I'll continue charging in his stead. Okay, so we'd like to get started. Anyone who's listening, can grab a seat, that would be great. Okay, so our last session today is buying into the church. Now, as you probably all become aware by now, Gail that was able to attend sends her apologies, so we only have one paper to speak, which is Charles's paper. We will adjourn a bit earlier. But we do on the upside have more time for questions. So people are encouraged to ask as much as you like.
All the time.
And we're starting 7 minutes late, uncharacteristically. So our one and only speaker in this session is Charles West from the Department of History at the University of Sheffield. Charles researches medieval history circa 700 to 1150, and especially formation, development, and transformation of cultural and political structures in the Longue Durée. He's currently working on a book for Oxford University Press on 11th century Europe. and on a book for the University of Toronto Press on the Carolingian Kingdom of Lotharingia. He is also the UK principal investigator of an Anglo-German research project on local priests in post-Carolingian Europe, titled Priests in a Post-Imperial World. Of his books, I will mention Neighbors and Strangers, authored with Bernard Zeller and others for Manchester University Press in 2020, and Reframing the Feudal Revolution, Political and Social Transformation between Marne and Moselle, circa 800 to 1100, published by Cambridge University Press. Charles's paper today will be The History of Simony in the 11th Century. Charles, please.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation here, and thank you all. Thank you everybody who's here for listening. I'm aware that I am all that stands between you and dinner, right? So you don't have to ask lots of questions. We could proceed on to dinner after this paper, but anyway. Okay, so until quite recent times, the purchase and sale of government office was generally considered acceptable within reasonable parameters in many parts of the world, including Europe. And when I say until quite recent times, I say this from a medieval historical perspective, right? So it's all relative. But the purchase and sale of ecclesiastical office, by contrast, was consistently condemned within church traditions from an early date. And yet, though this condemnation was long-standing, it is generally acknowledged, and I think right, that the criticism became more forceful and urgent in the Latin West in the 11th century, which is when the term simony, simonia, in Latin, was first coined as an abstract noun to describe the practice of purchasing or selling a church office. Now, exactly what it was which provoked this 11th century moral panic around simony is still a topic of debate amongst historians. Was this renewed criticism of simony a reflection of growing commercialization and the circulation of money? Or did it spring from fresh theological doubts about the validity of simoniacal ordination? Or was it something to do with changes in how the church was conceptualized? And also, actually, when did this debate pick up pace? Already early in the 11th century, or maybe more towards the middle of the century? These are all important questions which all need they're desperately calling out more research. But what I'm interested in today is that the history of simony itself has a history. And in this paper, I want to focus on one of the earliest articulations of that history. So in other words, this paper is not actually about history of simony in the 11th century. It's the history of simony of the 11th century. In other words, what people at this point in time thought was the history of simony. And I say, just to reiterate, simony is the practice of buying or selling church office. Now, my guide to this question is going to be the prominent monk and cleric Humbert of Silva Candida, or Humbert of Moyen-Moutier. He was an influential figure at the papal court in the mid-11th century, and he dies in 1061. Now, Humbert was actually very highly attuned to the languages of pollution. In 1054, for instance, he wrote a treatise attacking the Greeks, the Byzantines, for using leavened bread for the communion mass. He says this is polluted bread. Actually, it's polluted. It's being polluted by the yeast, which makes it rise. It's in contrast to the purer and, as well, in his view, more authentic unleavened version, which was used in the Latin church. These languages of pollution also, though, crop up in his major work, which is a treatise that is the closest thing we have to a history of simony in the 11th century. And this is the Liber Tres contra Simoniacos, or the 3 books against the Simoniacs. That's say people who bought or sold office in the church. And in this very lengthy book, written around 1058, Humbert argued that simony was an infection, a poison, and that its adherents spread not grace, but spiritual leprosy and pollution. And his main focus here was really typological. He wanted to prove that simony was a heresy, and specifically a kind of heresy which meant that people ordained by simoniacs had not really been ordained to them. His argument is that since the Holy Spirit cannot be bought for money, you can't just buy it, it follows that simoniac priests had not received it. And since you cannot give what you do not have, it follows that they cannot give it to anyone else either. Okay, so they just cannot perform valid ordinations. For most part, his argument is built out of skillful and slightly tedious quotations from a range of canon law and other authoritative sources, but he also uses analogy. And for instance, he likens the situation of a simoniac priest to that of a corrupt judge, a iudex corruptus, who is bribed with money to make unjust and actually therefore invalid judgment which has no legal force. Okay, so far, so Mary Douglas. But alongside this typological argument, Humbert also wove a historical account of this heresy's origin and its flourishing into his analysis. So Sam, in this paper, I want to explore this aspect of Humbert's thinking and what it tells us about histories of corruption, purity, and pollution. Now, at one level, the history of simony that Humbert tells us is very simple. Simony was invented, so to speak, by a man named Simon Magus, as described in the biblical book Acts of the Apostles. And the Acts describe how this man Simon approaches the apostles who are working these extraordinary miracles, and he offers them money. He says, you know, this is what you're doing is amazing, right? You know, if you kind of share this with me, I will pay you. And this is a blasphemous suggestion which instantly kind of rejects it, of course. That was the original Acts of Simony. I mean, it's named after Simon. Simony is he defines it. He defines the nature of the sin. So for Humbert, to be a Simoniac in the 11th century was to reenact the deed of this arch villain, although for Humbert is actually even worse, because Simon only tried to buy the Holy Spirit, whereas his modern followers wanted to both buy and sell it. Now, this consistency over time in the nature of simony was essential to Humbert's thinking, because it is what grounds his view of simony as a sin against the Holy Spirit, and that is what means it's heretical. And it's from this perception of simony as a heresy which flows all the rest of his thinking about it, including, and it's controversial, his point about the invalidity of simoniacal ordinations, which is something he insists with great vehemence. It's very controversial because it casts into doubt the whole structure of the church fundamentally, because, you know, there could be many people being ordained by Simoniac priests who may not even know it actually, and their ordinations are not valid either. So it poses a very serious problem. Nevertheless, although there was no simony before Simon Magus, Humbert does notice and draw attention to what he thinks was prefigurations in the Old Testament. And of particular interest is the figure of Jason, a figure in the book of Maccabees, who bought the high priesthood of Jerusalem, actually, the summum sacerdotium of Jerusalem, from the ruler Antiochus for 360 talents for the sake of ambition. So for Humbert, Jason is the archetype, is the typus in Latin for Simon Magus. And actually, Jason, according to the Vulgate, goes on to promote Greek customs, actually gentilis ritus, which led Humbert to kind of think, well, maybe Simon is also associated with paganism, right, in some way. Okay, fine. So these prefigurations in the Old Testament notwithstanding, Humbert's view is that simony is a Christian heresy, and that meant then the nature of this sin had not substantially changed since the days of the early church. But though the nature of this sin had not changed, Humbert was emphatic that its function had. And he identifies two major turning points. The first of these is the Peace of Constantine. Now, for Humbert, after Simon Magus, simony itself vanishes, right? And that's because the church is suffering persecution. It is not attracting greedy and ambitious people. They don't want to be join the church. As he put it in his 3 books, quote, in truth, this ambition for ecclesiastical dignity vanished from the times of the apostles to the times of the Christian rulers, deterred by the cruel persecution, since whoever seems to be the leader and more powerful than the others was tortured first and more harshly. Okay, so in other words, no one is buying their way into the church because you're just buying your way to be tortured. So no one does that. But when Emperor Constantine converts Christianity and the persecution ends, well, then the church begins to accrue wealth and property as the donations flood in. And that meant there is then an incentive for ambitious people to, as Humbert sees it, copy Simon Magus, and this they did in increasing number. And in Humbert's words, when Constantine brings peace to the church, quote, the old plague comes back. But Humbert still thinks this early post-Constantinian phase of simony in the Latin West was, if not benevolent, at least mitigated. Because at this stage, Simoniacs were using their own money to purchase their position in the church. And that meant then their negotiations were actually enriching the church, right? They make these donations basically to become bishops, but that is their money which actually is going into the, it's certainly not taken away from the church, and arguably sometimes is going into it. Now, in the eyes of this naive and simple, the indocti, this excused what they had done. Right? Humbert says, no, there's no excuse for this at all, of course, but it does mean the consequences are less severe. That, though, had changed in the more recent past. When Humbert looks around in 1058, he sees ruined churches and impoverished clerics. And let me quote him again at some length, describing his contemporary situation. So everywhere, and especially throughout all of Italy, churches of God and monasteries and other religious places can be seen that have been pulled down and overthrown from their foundations. Some have even been dug up. Some are in fearful condition with half-demolished roofs and walls which threaten to destroy them. Some have been deserted by men and abandoned to noxious beasts, not as any old beast, noxious beasts, and unclean birds. Some are filled with thickets and nettles. Some, although they seem from the outside to have their walls and buildings still standing and inhabited, are nevertheless despoiled of all their interior furnishings. Some, which were once renowned for their many and varied manners, castles, towns, familia of servants and cattle, well, now they retain not even the meanest little field or little hut, nor a slave, nor a donkey, nor a goat, to such an extent that now a strange farmer ploughs and cultivates the very yard of the sanctuary and the cemeteries of the Christians and fills them with crops and vines. This picture of complete desolation. And Humbert blames this very visible and very material sign of decay on a change in how simony worked. Because he says at a certain point, the wickedness had advanced to a new level. Simoniacs had stopped using their own money to buy their position. Instead, they started leveraging the church's own future income, including its future revenues. So in modern terms, they begin to act like a private equity, which kind of buys a company and saddles it with the debt of its own purchase. For Humbert, this utilization of money, which does not even exist yet, of revenues that have not yet been collected, made Simoniacs worse than ravaging barbarians. Because he says even the Vandals and the Goths and the Huns and the Lombards and the Hungarians, they'd been really bad. They had devastated the church, but these Simoniacs left nothing even for future clerics, quote, except tears. And Humbert is more specific. What lies behind this devastation of the future as well as the present is a very specific thing. It's the spread of what he calls devilish contracts. And these are written agreements by which ecclesiastical lands are handed over to lay powers until the end of time. And the church's own privileges and chirographs are emptied and nullified. He says no canon, no synodal or papal decree, no imperial edict or precept can stand in the way of these legal contracts. And no one can advance to any position within the church unless he promised to observe and defend these libelli, as Humbert calls them. And actually, Humbert says the same is true of the emperors. As he puts it, the great ruler, the emperor, is compared to swear that he will not observe the laws of the religious rulers before him, or even his own, but that he will rather empty them. He wishes those things that are of Caesar to be given to him from people who refuse to give to God what are God's. Let him see, I beg, what is this empire to him, which turns him from a Christian into a pagan. In fact, Humbert says these emperors are worse than the pagan emperors because at least the pagan emperors have protected the property of their priests and temples, a practice that Constantine the Great had then adopted, and that emperors are kept, actually. Christian emperors are kept until, quotes, these dangerous times. So Humbert, the beast of simony had seemed tame before, but only now was its ferocity on full display. Okay, so Humbert has identified a break in time. Right? There's a rupture point. When had that taken place? At what point after the rule of Constantine the Great did this now begin? He doesn't give us a straightforward answer at this point in his treatise. He then moves on into a discussion of apocalyptic imagery, but he gives an indication later on in the treatise when he comes to how emperors appointed bishops by using the ring and staff. And that was something which Humbert said was new, right, and not known in earlier times. And essentially, the turning point for Humbert, the moment of change, was the Tempus Autonum, times of the Etonians. So these are the rulers after in the 10th century. Now, for some 11th century writers, looking back, this was a glorious, peak of imperial rule, right? But for Humbert, this was when things started to go very badly wrong. The madness, the rabies of trafficking in ecclesiastical office spread, he says, throughout Germany, Gaul, and Italy from the times of the Etonians until Emperor Henry III, not an Etonian, Thessalian, who died just a few years before Humbert wrote. Henry tried to do something about this, but hadn't really been able to do much about it. It's interesting that Humbert, by the way, is quite positive about Henry III, whereas some contemporaries are also quite critical, but Humbert's got a different narrative. The Carolingians actually are all right in Humbert's narrative. They had never imposed on the church, but under the Etonians, the strength of the papacy waned, so that, I quote, because of their cowardice and incipience, he's talking about the popes here, and because of the arrogance of the neophyte rulers, those are the Etonians, every ecclesiastical office and right was gradually taken away and extorted from their hands as they struggled to retain even the name of their former dignity, not even the dignity in itself. The Etonians, who are worse, praesumptores, presumers against, I suppose, of the ecclesiastical offices than all the kings before them, that's a quote, had they been divinely punished for their sins, of course, by having their dynasty cut prematurely short. They had established 2 bishoprics, Humbert acknowledges that, and he's referring here to Magdeburg and probably Bamberg. That counts for nothing because they were built from the spoils of countless Italian churches, right? And that reminds me of the conversation earlier about the kind of the pollution kind of carrying across from they're doing a holy thing, but actually because it's built from their spoliation, it doesn't really work. He also, though, introduces a geographical comparison. Humbert argues that simony was less prevalent and less ruinous in Byzantium, which he calls the overseas empire, than it was in the Latin West. Now, Humbert had actually visited Constantinople in 1054, and he'd taken the opportunity to kind of find out how things worked. It had made a big impression on him. Quote, as I learned from what I heard and saw when I was in the royal city of Constantinople, when I was there to give a response from the Apostolic See, because he was there as a papal legate, and as I heard from the lips of Emperor Konstantinos Monomachos of Orthodox memory himself, right? So he had an audience with the emperor. Neither the emperor nor any layman dares have any control of churches or ecclesiastical ordinations and resources. But all these things, as they were left before, are left now to the control of the metropolitans and ecclesiastical people from the time of the great Emperor Constantine. Now, the outcome of the 1054 visit shows that Humbert was not exactly a big fan of the Greek church, right? I mean, that doesn't go totally well. But it's interesting then that when Emperor Konstantinos Monomachos tells him that, the church here works just the same as it always has since the time of the Emperor Constantine the Great, Humbert is very ready to believe it. Says, yeah, that's how it is. That means, he says, that bishops, yeah, they do, and they might sell ecclesiastical office, but at least these transactions are being kept within the church. They're not being multiplied, and that keeps everything more manageable, or as Humbert puts it, magus tolerabile. It's more tolerable. And I say he contrasts this historical continuity, actually, he sees it in Constantinople with the, quotes, arrogance and greed of the rulers of our own age, the nostrum seculum. Now, most historians have not paid much attention to Humbert's narrative about the history of simony, except to dismiss it as a mischaracterization. Essentially, especially because he's very rude about the 10th century popes, right? And so most people say, they weren't really that bad. Actually, though, in some ways, he was demonstrably right. Philippe Depreux has demonstrated how investiture of bishops through handing them ring and staff was, as Humbert pointed out, relatively new in the early 11th century. It's also demonstrable that in the 10th century, North Italian bishops, this is where Humbert's writing, do begin to lease out property, especially churches, on a quite large scale, in fact. And Maya Mascarinec has recently shown there is quite widespread anxiety in Italy about the leasing agreements, these libelli or livelli, which Humbert mentions. People are talking about these documents, these contracts, these devilish contracts before Humbert writes. And there is actually some evidence to suggest these contracts really are impoverishing the church. The best archive is that from Lucca, another Tuscan city not far from where Humbert is writing, actually in Florence. And that archive shows 100 leases of churches from this period. And these churches are leased with all their tithe income too, okay, which is future income as well. One bishop, Teudgrim, leases out no fewer than 48 churches to aristocratic families in a single year, 983, when he's first appointed. He arrives in this church, his first thing to do is hand out these churches through leases. And they are effectively handed out for the long term, right? They're given out usually in exchange for a small, almost nominal annual census. And this was a major transfer then of church property. Historians have reflected and speculated on what drove this frenzy, but given its timing, it might well reflect the settling of debts, political as well as economic, which Bishop Teudgrim, for instance, had incurred in his appointment. Now, was this leasing really linked to the interference of the laity in the church? Or in other words, how did Ottonian appointment of bishops through ring and staff connect to the despoilment of the churches through the Libelli? So these are the two wings of Humbert's arguments, and the connection between them is a bit vague. He implies that imperial control over episcopal appointments had led to a market in these appointments, and that's what's driving the rapacity of the Simonists. Basically, he's become a bishop, it's now really expensive, right? And then you've got to get that, you've got to recoup that money back. Ultimately, this is unsubstantiated. I mean, I cannot tell you whether Bishop Teudgrim of Lucca was raising money in 983 specifically to pay a debt to the emperor, directly or indirectly, but it is possible, I think. There is a letter from a man who later becomes the Bishop of Arezzo called Imo. And this letter, before he becomes bishop, he's writing to somebody, he's sounding out, he's saying, I'm going to approach the bishop to become a provost. How much should I offer? £half of gold. Is that about right? And it's, if it's in exchange for your advice, I can offer you a nice cloak. Oh, and by the way, please destroy this letter, which they didn't, which is how we know. But anyway, the point is there is, you can see this kind of negotiation is going on, and the prices are quite high, in fact. And what we can also say, though, with certainty is that there was definitely a contemporary perception that emperors could and maybe should do something about these leases. And there's a famous imperial edict issued, apparently anyway, in Pavia in 998, known as the Capitulare Ticniense, which just means the Pavian capitulary. So it's an imperial edict which decrees that all these leasing arrangements with the church would henceforth expire automatically with the death of the bishop, and the lands would then kind of return back to the church. This is written in the name of Emperor Otto III, the son of Theophany mentioned earlier by Wolfram. But this text spread very little, actually, and made no impact at all, as far as we can see on the archive. It was just totally ignored. One wonders whether this was the sort of legislation which people wanted the emperors to make, and that they either didn't or at least made no effort to enforce it. In a way, though, I think what's less interesting for today is whether Humbert's perception is right than the fact that it's articulated in the first place. Most debates about simony in the 11th century, and there's a lot of discussion about it, do not give this historical angle which Humbert provides. An example here is Peter Damian, another 11th century Italian writer, and like Humbert comes from North the Alps. Peter Damian writes a lot about simony. He has nothing to say really about his history beyond the fact it goes back to Simon Magus, and it's very bad. And I think that's probably because the debate comes to focus very strongly on the nature, on the nature, not the function of simony. Because almost no one defends simony as a practice. I mean, some people do defend the investiture of bishops, and they do defend actually the deposition of emperors. There are things being discussed which there are two sides. For simony, there's not really two sides to this debate. Everyone agrees it's bad. There are some very rare exceptions. For example, Bishop Benzo of Alba, who defends it, saying he defends it though on just practical grounds, not historical grounds. He doesn't say this is custom or practice. He just says that many things do happen against legitimate practice when needs must. There's nothing just cogente necessitate, right? So in other words, the debate about simony, which we see following from Humbert, which he certainly helped initiate, or at least give prominence to, does not really hang on its history in a way. So the history of simony matters to Humbert, doesn't matter to people so much after him. Just occasionally we pick up on a hint that someone had been influenced by this approach. Cardinal de Stedit writes in Libellus, 1090s, where he has some similar ideas, I think, about post-Constantine church being a bit different, but really there's not much more than that. And I think it's interesting because Humbert's historical account of simony is actually more nuanced and more subtle than the use of history and contemporary material associated with Gregorian reform in general, because simony isn't discussed in historical terms, but other things are. But as Hans Werner Goetz has studied in a famous article, the use of history here is pretty unsubtle normally. Authors intervene in topics like investiture of bishops or deposition of emperors by making anecdotal references to past instances. You know, Gregory VII is okay to depose Emperor Henry IV because Pope Nicholas had deposed King Lothar II. So yeah, that's okay. Or Ambrose had excommunicated Emperor Theodosius. Right? And actually, these examples are often wrong, but that's beside the point. What's interesting actually is those examples are Goetz described them as very unhistorical, right? They're not really trying to understand how things might have been different in the past. They're just finding precedents to suit the arguments they're trying to make. Humbert, though, I think is doing something different. His views do seem to develop from an attempt to understand, and we might even say historicize, a problem of his own day. And I think it's for that reason that the Etonians play so major an argument in his role, because most of the 11th century historical debates don't really talk about the Etonians very much. Okay, let me come to a conclusion. Humbert of Silva Candida had not read Ferdinand Braudel, okay? But he nevertheless offers us a history of simony that works at three levels, something like the longue durée, the histoire conjoncturelle, and the histoire événementielle of simony, linked to the invention of the sin, the growing wealth of the church, and then the particular circumstances which had obtained in recent times. Now, underneath these levels, he's also using three different kinds of sources. We've got condemnations from the church fathers and the canons of the church, the works of Pseudo-Isidore, the written histories of the Christian church, especially that written by Cassiodorus, Historia Tripetita, which he reads and cites. And finally, actually, I think also his own personal experiences and conversations, because he doesn't seem to have any written sources for the Etonian emperors at all, right? This is when he condemns the Etonian emperors, he's not citing anybody, as far as I can tell. Now, in some ways, this is a very different history of simony from the one which modern historians tell today. That's partly because I guess if we attempt to rehabilitate the 10th century popes, it's also though because historians today put a lot more emphasis on the role of Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century in expanding the nature of the concept of simony and in labeling simoniacal acts as heresy. And Humbert takes that as a given, right? It's always been heretical. Actually, that seems to have been an intervention of the 6th century. Okay, so the history we tell today of simony is a bit different from the one which Humbert tells. Humbert cites Gregory a lot, by the way, but not as historical source, right? He's a kind of theological authority. But in other ways, Humbert's account anticipates modern accounts of simony in arguing for development over time and according to context, and thinking about how practices of gift exchange change in relationship to a changing society, in other words, were socially rooted, and in thinking about how simony was embedded in interactions which integrated social activity from the rural fields of Italy to the imperial courts of the Etonian rulers. He could have given a paper at this conference, I think. Now, his suggestion that the recent development of leasing as a form of capitalizing on future as well as past church revenues, and that this was a critical development in turbocharging simony and fundamentally changed the impact of its nature on the church, is, I think, an interesting perspective to which we might want to give a bit more attention than, seems to me anyway, has been paid. But perhaps more important for this conference, though, is how his 3 books against the simoniacs offers a history of corruption which works without a golden age. There is no, fully idealized or purified past. The only time when there was really no simony at all was during the persecution, right? Which is not exactly an ideal time for the church. What followed it was a time of moderate simony, a bit like the one that he sees in Byzantium of his own day, which for all its problems though was greatly preferable to the untrammeled, destructive simony whose efforts Humbert saw all around him in Italy. But he's got this very, he's got this, there is no golden age, it's quite a nuanced and differentiated account. Now, why it was written like this is, I think, hard to account for, but I wonder whether part of the answer lies in Humbert's concern with the future, and perhaps with the inkling that the future could be better than the present, or even the past, if only people would listen to him. Stop there, thank you very much.
So, thank you, Charles, for this really fascinating discussion. I open the floor to questions, which I'm sure there will be.
I just have a quick question. What is the ring in the staff? Where does that come from?
So there are people who can probably better place also than me, but that is so these are the symbols of episcopal office. So when you become a bishop, these are the tokens of your office, and what seems to happen from the 10th century is they are physically handed over to the bishop by the emperor.
But where does it come from? The ring in the staff.
They're basically late Roman, is my understanding. So they have always had, the bishops have always had these symbols of their office. What changes is the ritual by which they are, by which they are given to the bishop elects. The implication being it's now the emperor who's making the bishop and is actually conferring the sacred office. But yeah, they are they're not new in themselves. Like
No, I have some rings and staffs in my sources.
All right. I mean, I think so in the 9th century they are reinterpreted. The ring is reinterpreted in the 9th century as a token of the bishop's marriage to his church.
Is it to seal things? So it
Ultimately,
make so that's the same.
So ultimately, I think it goes back to that, but I say it's reinterpreted actually. So it becomes the staff as the kind of powerful kind of sticky thing. So I think the ring it does go back to the Roman seal ring, but it's actually been reinterpreted and it's now seen as the idea of the bishops in married to his church. But so now the meaning does change a bit actually. But I say what gets in is it should be the metropolitan or someone or the pope, whatever, who should give that to the bishop and not a secondary. And he's right, that does seem to have changed.
Yeah, thank you for your interesting data. I'd like to ask whether that we could say anything about the opponents of this view. We know that there is the libelli delita during the investiture contest. Do they contradict his argument? Of course, when he idealized the Byzantine emperor, it's striking, but in the very same year, 1054, the schism was started. That's been around for almost 1,000 years. So, but more to the point, when he so much in favor of the Byzantine emperor, he might have been also in favor of Otto III. Otto III was the only emperor in the Middle Ages who spent some time as being resident in Rome, and he tried to institute a kind of symphonia with the Pope Gregory V, whom he instituted as Pope. So didn't he try, or did not try to imitate in a way the Byzantine emperor? So the Etonians might have been presented as imitating the Byzantine example. So was this taken up by some of the authors of the Libelli Delita? And another question would be, who is included in the Etonian? So modern historians would include Henry II, but he's not called Otto, so maybe he's not considered an Etonian, but it's ironic that in a century later, Henry II is being canonized alongside his wife Kunigunde. So they are saints of the church, and so it's ironic there's a saint of the church may be included in these row of evil emperors. So I wonder whether such arguments were being used by authors of the opposing, or might have been used by the authors opposing this view. Because I think historians could argue against this. Yeah. Contemporaries may have done so as well.
I count that from as 4 questions at least. But I mean, let me say no. So I mean, okay. So relationships Byzantium. He knows it as he's been there. He is. I don't think he's. it's not great. It's just it's better than the situation he sees around him. I mean, it's interesting. He's quite, in a sense, he's criticizing the church. He's just saying the structures of the way in which the church relates to secular power are better, right? So the emperor the emperor himself has told him that he doesn't interfere in how the church is run. So that is greatly superior. But yeah, I mean, obviously he's not. He is blisteringly critical of certain things in the way in which the Byzantine church operates, including in kind of doctrinal questions, and writes a lot about that. So it's very much a relative. He's drawing a relative comparison here. And I think one of the point that does link to your point about his idea of the Ottonians. He doesn't different. It's tempus Ottonum, right? So it's the Ottonians, and so exactly who he has in mind. And Henry II is interesting. He doesn't talk about Henry II much, but I suspect Otto III would be high on his hit list, precisely because of the very close relationship with the papacy. Because I think what Humbert doesn't like are these kings basically emperors appointing popes and really kind of pulling the strings of the papacy. And of course, Otto, you know, it's the third in particular is very strong on that. The only other thing is how this picks up in the Libelli Delite. These aspects are not picked up very much. So the Byzantine question is not, the conversation moves away from that really, and actually also history. The key issue becomes the validity of the ordinations. That becomes the really hot topic, in that if you have been ordained by somebody and you haven't paid yourself, but they paid for their office, is your ordination valid? And of course, if it's not, it means the mass is all useless. And so, you know, many people are going to go to hell and so on. So it's got huge implications. Humbert is a strict person here, and he says no, because you can't get what you don't have, you can't give what you do not have. Other people though have, eventually go back to Augustine and say, oh, you know, the kind of the Holy Spirit can kind of works through people. So the ordinations of a ceremonial priest are valid, but that's the real, that's the bit of his argument that really that sparks controversy. So his historical arguments, they get, yeah, they're no longer crucial to the debate. I think that's essentially the debate moves on.
Thank you very much. Very. So my question was about whether the claim that Simon impoverished the church because people were leveraging, so they didn't have money up front, whether that is novel or has basis. I do know that Nelson of Ravenna in the mid-9th century says something very similar about Simon impoverishing churches because people are buying it with money they don't have and then selling assets of the church to pay for it. And Nelson himself, by the way, despite the point, admits that he bought his own, not in the same context, but that he gave 200 gold coins to get his first appointment. So the point is this novel or in the 11th century? And if not, what does it mean? Because obviously, for the 9th century, all the 10th century developments that are being made against here are just not relevant.
Yeah, no, thank you. Okay, so on one level, I say, on one level, I'd say what interests me is actually he's making historical arguments at all, and I find that it's, you know, he's saying it's not just unlike Beesdale or these later people. He's not just saying Simon is an eternal problem. He is trying to differentiate it. So in a sense, I'm relaxed about whether he's right or wrong, but and it isn't. But then to come back, is he right or wrong? The problem is this is a question of scale, isn't it? And what he's identifying is a change in the level of scale, and he's saying this is now it's become much worse. And actually, that's really hard for us to know, because obviously people mostly did not keep records of these sorts of dealings. So, how much did it cost to become a bishop? It might change at the time. I mean, so it's very hard to put a level of things. His perception was that things were worse. But I take your point. I mean, this is not entirely new. So yeah, but I say it's very hard to quantify, because the only accounts we have are sometimes hyperbolic. In fact, nearly always. I mean, it's all only that letter I mentioned from Imo of Worms, actually, is German cleric who becomes bishop in Italy. That's really quite exceptional in appearing to be a genuine, you know, just about the right price. Kind of like that's a genuine kind of sounding out about real prices rather than Peter Damien saying, "Oh, it's for sale for thousands of pounds of gold," which you don't. Yeah. So, but that's so. Yeah. I mean, it's an insoluble problem. As it is, he right that this has scaled up or not? But I take your point. Some skepticism might be, yeah.
Yes, two questions, one of curiosity and one of ignorance. The curiosity one, if you could probably see why. Does he discuss what are the mechanisms to reintegrate the Simoniac, priests and what happens to them? And the question of ignorance is in general surveys, it's often associated simply with nepotism. So does he discuss this? Is it relevant or later or?
That's interesting. Okay, reintegration is quite straightforward. There is none. Right. If you bought your office,
You're layman.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that's you kind of you blot your copybook. There is no, you're out because you might perhaps be admitted back to communion if you're
I
really.
guess I should have been more specific. What happens to the baptism of the? Is there, do they mention this?
He does. He has a long discussion about this, and actually, I think he's forced to concede that the baptisms are okay. Okay, so
He's following the
because
doctrine.
yeah, and he's kind of he feels he has to, and he kind of sense he's struggling against this, but he can't. It is written into various the late antique tradition, right? So he does follow the boat there, but that's the baptism is the exception, if I remember rightly. Simon nepotism, that's an interesting question. He does not talk about that at all, and actually, in different contexts, people have seen Simon actually as actually you can see it as working with. You can also see it as working against nepotism because it's a way in which you can actually break into charmed circles. And I'm thinking here, rather off topic, in I think at the 18th century Spanish Empire, there was an argument. People were arguing for simony precisely, or not simony, for buying government office precisely because it meant you didn't have to be related to the right person to stand a chance of moving up in the world. Right. So in a sense, it can be an anti-nepotistic move. It's a chance for you to, it doesn't. These things, these high offices don't just go to people you already know. There's, you can everyone can make a bid, right? Which in some ways a much better system. Was the argument they made then. He doesn't really talk about that at all, though. So he doesn't talk about the question of nepotism, which I think in his context doesn't. And I think this is the point in the way that the emperor is quite dominant in the context he's talking about, and there's not, the emperor is not really appointing his family members, and it's the way the Imo of Worms, for example, who ends up Bishop of Arezzo, he's not related, certainly not closely to the emperor, and he's certainly not related to anyone in Arezzo, right? These people are just being parachuted in. So Simon is creating a market for the most wealthy, talented people. But yeah, so. But okay, obviously there's something to follow up tomorrow.
Jennifer?
Yeah, so thank you, Charles. I had two questions. First of all, in some ways, this was nice to come after Angela's with another person who really irritated lots of people.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering a little bit about the portrayal of Italy that you quoted of a desolate ecclesiastical landscape and churches in ruins and etc. And it's one thing to document an increase in mobility and an economic shift, but a collapsed ecclesiastical landscape is, at least to the best of my knowledge, not something that we could really document or archaeologically or through documentary sources or other evidence. It just seems rather extreme, and again. Hence the comment about, Jerome Humbert is somebody who, was not out to make friends. And, is known for exaggerating, but I'm sort of curious then about that portrayal and how that would have been a convincing rhetorical move when, at least, from what we know, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's wrong.
Yeah.
And then I was also interested in your point, not just that the Ottonians are sort of interesting choice, and yes, it's related to the papacy when you were answering about Otto III. But the lack of sources, if he's not, you know, quoting the obvious Ottonian stuff, what is he working from? And is he using other historical material in other ways that might, you know, particularly bring him to some of the more obvious things that you might think about? You know, some of the Carolingian material, for instance, that's so regularly cited in the Libelle Delite and, you know, in the whole debates. So it's sort of where that historical framework was coming. So those were my questions.
Thank you, Janine. I can't really answer over them, but I will try. I mean, so yes, okay, perception about Italy. He does portray it as a kind of Mad Max landscape. It's all like things laid waste and so on. It doesn't chime with what we know. I mean, I guess we should remember one aspect here, and here I'm frantically speculating. He is a northerner, right? So he comes either Humbert is not Italian. He's educated in north of the Alps. He comes into Italy. Is he seeing Roman ruins and thinking, you know, wow, these all used to be church? Like I'm kind of seeing these there's lots of stuff here. They must have been churches. I wonder about that. What you can see though, so I mean, it is certainly in some of these cities in Tuscany, these churches have been they have been handed out to lay families. Whether they are quite in the state of ruin, which he suspects, I agree, is probably exaggerated. Although I don't know, it's hard to. I would have to read more about archaeological evidence for the for these churches than I have done to answer that question. But so the short answer, I don't know, but but I take your point. He may be exaggerating just a tiny bit. And the sources for it, I mean, I've drawn a blank, frankly, and here I am. I mean, the editors of this text have also not seen anything. So it's, you know, it's all actually Carolingian history writing as well. I can't see that. There's a lot of Cassiodorus. You can see that crops up. Who cites explicitly says he mentions Cassiodorus by name, and that is something he works in. And where he's getting the ideas, then why he's going with the Ottonians in particular, I haven't got an answer to that. I suspect. I mean, he is not a popular person. True, but he's very well connected, and so I think he's part of kind of circles of conversation or discussion, which could be kind of giving him historical accounts secondhand, so to speak, or interacting. But what they might be, I don't know. So yeah, if anyone knows, let me know.
Yeah, rather quick. Jennifer asked one question that I was curious about, and sort of that is sources. I admit I really wanted some good anecdotes about these evil ceremonious priests I'm sorry, not priests, but bishops who are, you know, like there must be like tales of the bad bishops. If you come across some, please publish that. Some part of the medieval library maybe. There has to be, because otherwise who would have an issue with it that much? My other little question is about please destroy this letter. Was there a specific method requested by which the letter be destroyed?
Right.
Yes, I have a selfish motive.
Okay, tales of bad bishops. I mean, there are loads from later, right? As in later essentialist people being bishops are being deposed for Simon all over the place.
Yes, but I want to know exactly like what, like the actions that cause this to be a bad thing.
Yeah, they don't. I mean, usually they just say so and so bought his office, and they don't usually say much.
But the whole reason behind this is that is it just the money changing hands, or is it also that it allows immoral people to be bishops?
Actually, I mean, it really focuses. I mean, obviously, simony becomes an all-purpose accusation, given that lots of people have bought their office. You throw it at people you don't like, right? And so it is often associated with kind of moral criticisms. You say he's a really bad, you know, Mass is a really bad bishop because he bought his office and he's also immoral. Whether there is actually a connection there, I don't know. My impression is probably there is so much in the exchange of favors that basically everybody, you might be very, and actually Immo is a good example. The Immo Burns, linking to your second question, the cleric who I keep on mentioning now, maybe I should get a paper about him instead. Who, before he becomes bishop in Italy, he writes he's very educated actually, and he's also very ambitious, And you can see he's basically negotiating for a job for us and saying, oh, is there an opening here? But he writes a very sophisticated Latin, and he's possibly, I don't think he's actually even the magister, like is he a school, the schoolmaster at Burns, I can't remember, but he's quite, he's kind of rising up. So in other words, he's not an untalented figure by any means. He's not a mediocre or but he still has to, he still has to kind of find the money to get his way in. So yeah, I don't necessarily think we can say this is letting the worst people in. Obviously, people are saying that at the time, but I'm not sure we can make that judgment.
Okay.
Isn't that where the Simon Magus comes into play a little bit? Because I mean, he's a magician. Right?
Yeah.
He doesn't have faith, right? I mean, he wants like tricks.
Sure, and I mean, and Humbert's point is all these people are heretics because obviously they don't believe in the Holy Spirit properly. Because how could they possibly believe the Holy Spirit? You can make him act like a slave in saying, "Come here, I'm buying you. Come to me at once." And that is, that's right. That is intrinsically an immoral and heretical thing to do.
Is this like a rhetorical trope, or is it taken seriously as a heresy?
It is taken seriously as heresy. I mean, this is why Robert will to confirm, but no, it is obvious. Hymenaea Hierasis is from Gregory the Great. So,
Yeah, it's in lists.
he's the one who really makes this, and this Isabel Rosé has been working a lot on the way in which this creation of this heretical. So no, it is treated as heresy, actually. Yeah, he's not the only one. At least it's talked about as heresy. Actually, your question about how the letter is to be destroyed, I can't remember on that project. I can't remember if it says burn me or not. It may not do. That's
Better if not, but.
okay.
We'll talk later.
Just start smoking.
Robert?
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting. Just to response to Yanni's question, well, additional response. It was very easy to make simony a heresy because already in the 2nd century, when you are building the history of the apostolic succession, in parallel, you build a history of the heretical succession, and Simon the Magus is at the very beginning. So it starts with the discussions with the Gnostics, but when you need it later, it is there. So that was easy. But I strongly sympathize with the image of ecclesiastical property. Which you presented, because we have very frequently this imagination or this picture of ecclesiastical property as a constant accumulation. Actually, it was a reservoir which was leaking. Well, always leaking. So going back to what Amos said, and I think that there are problems. 3 possibilities to interpret what happens in the 11th century. Either the reservoir is leaking more, well, as you have shown that there is something pointing into this direction, or there is a new rhetoric, but not really, because we really see it all, at least in the 6th century or even later, or there's maybe, but it's really a question. There is something which changes the perspective, so people are more aware that the reservoir is leaking than before. And I wonder whether you can see anything in the at the beginning of the 11th century, which would make people, well, more annoyed by the fact that this, this is leaking. I'm thinking, for instance, but this is really for instance. I mean, when you can see the leaks in the 6th century, it's mostly because the clergy are married, and it's because of that. That the church loses the property because the children take it over. So I wonder whether the fact that we are going, well, more enthusiastically towards the
celibacy changes the situation, and they say, well, that's done. So let's take care about different things.
Okay, so thank you, Robert. So this leaky sieve is a great way of thinking about church property. I mean, I guess some of you will know, others won't. There's this wonderful article, very old article now, by David Hurley, which I had occasion to revisit for this, where he tries, and it's a really interesting text, to work out how much land the church owned, right, as a proportion. And you think, how can you possibly do that? Because what he did is he looked at when land is transferred, it has boundaries, right? It says, this land is next to the land of Bob and William or whatever, but sometimes it's the Terra Sancti Martini and the Terra so on. And he looks at those boundary clauses and to try and work out, is this land which is being transferred, who are its neighbours? And he works out on that basis that about a third of all the land of Europe is, of the Latin West anyway, is owned by church. The church is in I think it peaks in, I'm going to say the early 9th century, and then it actually just constantly declines, quite gradually, but it just kind of goes gradually down. So, so it's kind of 33% down to about 25%, whatever. So it's still substantial. The church is still obviously enormously rich, but nonetheless, the bucket is leaking, right? That said, of course, there is, it's not leaking, more stuff is coming in as well. So there is a constant cycle. So you're quite, and I think that's thank you for that point. There is a flux and so on. That happens all the time. Your question is there a change in that perception? And I think there is, and you link it to celibacy, and obviously in the 11th century, there is this push towards clerical celibacy, in the sense of not priests never being allowed to marry, whereas previously they have been allowed to marry as long as they separated, and now we get this new situation where no marriage at all is implemented, slowly but surely. That has often been associated with property, and to some extent that is true in the texts as well, although quite a lot of their defence of hostility to married clergy is linked actually explicitly to pollution. Really, it's as much about sexual activity and purity as anything else. But yeah, nonetheless, occasionally it does talk about the problem of the children, and as you said, that they end up getting their hands on the church. But I guess behind that is, I wonder if there's this, I mean, for Humbert, for him, the church, land which is given to church is inalienable, technically, right? And this is, once it's given to church, it should never go out, right? Because it's been, and Humbert is really emphatic about that. It's sacred land, actually, to come back to this conference. It's been sanctified by the fact of having been given. And I wonder if what worries them about the children of the clergy is as much about, as you say, that they are very now, the status of the church property is now more sanctified than it had been, right? There's maybe a change in their conception of church property, which is making them worried about ways in which they're leaking. So you might be right there, Robert. Right? I'll have to think more about that. Thank you.
I wanted to comment regarding Jennifer, because I also saw the dilapidated landscape, and I wonder, you asked whether that could be evidence of archaeological remains. I think it's easier to think about evidence for renovations rather than to find archaeological remains of ruins. And of course, the 11th century is a huge century of renovation and rebuilding. And specifically in Italy, so you have the Cathedral of Pisa being built in 1063, you have rebuilding of Aquileia, you have rebuilding at Mantua under the auspices of Vittorio di Canossa, you have rebuilding at Florence, which leads to the baptistery. So you have monumental campaigns throughout Italy, which could indicate something about the state of everything that was there before. And even the wave of rebuilding of baptisteries and cathedrals in the 12th century wouldn't necessarily mean that's not a dismantlement of earlier monuments. Indeed, that's been an argument, and there's an argument also for, there are lots of archaeological remains which have been maintained under the levels of renovated 12th century churches purposefully, in order to show that they had rebuilt earlier structures. And because in Italy so much of the architecture had been made through late antiquity, it would make some sense that it was kind of falling apart at the seams of the 11th century. And even taking Rodolphus Glaber, you'd usually think about it for the white Mansfield churches, and I've always focused on the part of his sentence which says, so many churches were being replaced everywhere, even when there was no need for it. but then you could also take all those ones where there was actually a serious need for it.
Mhm.
And so the rebuilding could evidence something of that situation. Also urbanism.
I mean, thanks, Esther, that's really helpful, and I think, yeah, this point about maybe these churches just need they did need a lick of paint, right, refurbishments, and, because they've been around a while, and yeah, so thanks, it's really helpful. Most of the examples you gave are urban, right, and it's interesting that Humbert and that thing, his examples are mostly, he's explicitly talking about, these are now the sites of fields, right, so he's very much located.
Urbanism would be like the countryside.
Yeah.
How do people
It
live around- surrounding-
Yeah, no, but that's the, yeah, so exactly, yeah, so his vision is focused on the countryside, but that, you're right, that could be that's people are obviously leaving the countryside to join the cities, that could be, so in other words, his vision of this, of a, Italy in ruins, is a vision of a countryside in ruins, he's not saying the cities are in ruins, he doesn't talk about a actually, so thank you, that's, yeah, that is a good point, maybe they're in ruins because everyone's going to the cities.
Do we have any more questions? Actually, I think we did. We're shy of, 5 minutes shy of 6, so. Thank you very much.